The night air in Carmel was unusually still, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The California coastline stretched out beneath the stars, a quiet, majestic expanse of rolling hills and dark, whispering trees. Clint Eastwood's villa, perched atop one of the many cliffs overlooking the Pacific, was typically a place of peace and solitude for the Hollywood legend. But tonight, the silence was shattered by the unmistakable hum of police sirens. It started with a routine investigation. A minor renovation project beneath the Grand Villa had unearthed something entirely unexpected, a hidden passage. The workers, oblivious to the villa's storied past, thought it was just another part of the estate's aging foundation. But when they poked their heads into the opening, they found themselves staring down a long, narrow tunnel that seemed to stretch infinitely into the earth. By the time the police arrived, the workers had already retreated, wide-eyed and unsettled. It was rare for such a discovery to happen, especially at the home of someone like Clint Eastwood. His life, with all its fame and prestige, seemed too clean, too flawless to harbor such dark secrets. But the tunnel, it changed everything. It was as though a veil had been lifted, exposing a hidden world beneath the surface. Detective Sarah Jenkins was among the first to arrive at the scene. She was a seasoned investigator, having worked in the Bay Area for over a decade. But this was something else. There was an unmistakable tension in the air, as though the earth itself was holding its secrets. Clint Eastwood's name loomed over everything, casting a long shadow over the scene. It wasn't just the fact that this was his villa, it was Clint Eastwood, the man who had seemed to live an almost mythic existence, untouched by scandal. Who could have imagined that under his feet, hidden away for so long, lay a buried passageway? Sarah was no stranger to strange cases. But this was different. A forgotten tunnel? Beneath Clint Eastwood's villa? It didn't make sense. How could a man like him, with such a public life, have something like this lying in wait for decades? The tunnel entrance was cold and uninviting, and as the police began their preliminary investigation, it became clear that this wasn't some minor relic or abandoned feature of an old estate. No, this tunnel had been purposely concealed. The dust that had settled in it told a story of decades spent forgotten. But as Sarah peered deeper into the tunnel's blackened mouth, something inside her stirred. There was more to this. Much more. Detective Jenkins, one of the officers, called out to her, snapping her from her thoughts. He was holding something in his hand, an old, faded map. "We found this." It was rolled up in a small compartment inside the tunnel. Sarah stepped forward, her eyes scanning the officer's hand. The map, though weathered and ancient, was unmistakable in its detail. "What is it?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. She could feel the pulse of something big in her chest, like a freight train barreling towards her. "We don't know, but we found it beneath the floorboards near the entrance," the officer said, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "It's a map of the estate, but not like any we've seen before. It's like it's been marked with symbols, codes, things we can't quite make sense of." Sarah took the map from him carefully, her fingers tracing the worn edges. This wasn't just any map. There were markings on it, like a language only few could understand. And there, right beneath the villa, was an X, the exact location of the tunnel. But the map wasn't just showing the physical structure of the house. It showed something far more intricate, something hidden. Sarah looked around at the officers. "This doesn't make sense," she muttered, half to herself. Why would Clint Eastwood, of all people, have something like this in his home? As Sarah stared at the map, something tugged at her memory. Clint Eastwood, Hollywood's rugged star, the director of films that had shaped generations. The man with an enigmatic reputation, whose life had been one of success and mystery. The man who had built this villa with his own hands, layer by layer, brick by brick. But now, as the tunnel stretched before her, she couldn't help but feel that the Clint Eastwood the world knew was only a facade. What if there was more to his story, something that had been hidden away for years? The officers continued to probe the tunnel's depths, but there was a nagging sense of foreboding in the air. Sarah's mind raced. What kind of man built a secret passage under his home? What kind of secrets was Clint Eastwood hiding? "Do you think it's a trap?" one of the officers asked, his voice hesitant. "Not a trap," Sarah replied, her voice steady but filled with uncertainty. I think this is something else. Something older. At that moment, Sarah's phone buzzed. She glanced down at the message. It was a text from her colleague, Detective Mark Thompson, who had been on the case for hours now. The message was simple but chilling. You need to see this? Clint's family might be involved. Sarah's stomach tightened. Clint Eastwood had never been one to involve his family in the public eye. There were rumors about estranged relationships, but nothing concrete. Until now. The tunnel was no accident. And whatever was hidden down there, it was big. It was far bigger than Clint Eastwood's career, bigger than the villa itself. It was a mystery that could change everything. Everything about Clint, his family, and the life they'd carefully curated. As Sarah stood there, gazing at the entrance to the tunnel, she couldn't shake the thought that her entire life was about to change. The man who had been a legend in Hollywood had more secrets than anyone could ever imagine. And those secrets were buried beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. What's inside the tunnel? She whispered under her breath, as a shiver ran down her spine. This was only the beginning. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Clint Eastwood had always been a man of few words. His silences were as iconic as the lines he delivered on screen. The world knew him as the rugged, no-nonsense cowboy, the man who could stare down a villain with a mere glance or deliver a line that echoed in the hearts of millions. But beyond the silver screen, Clint's life had been much more complicated than anyone could imagine. And tonight, as Sarah Jenkins stood at the entrance of the hidden tunnel, she couldn't help but wonder just how much of Clint Eastwood's quiet demeanor was truly a mask. Born in San Francisco in 1930, Clint's early life had been far from glamorous. His parents, who had struggled through the Great Depression, were far removed from the stars and fame Clint would later encounter. Clint's father, a steelworker, and his mother, a piano teacher, tried their best to provide a stable home, but money was always tight. The Eastwood family moved frequently as Clint's father found work in various towns, and young Clint often found himself the new kid at school, trying to fit in while grappling with feelings of inadequacy. It was during his high school years that Clint discovered a love for acting, though it was initially more of a distraction than a calling. Clint had always been a loner, preferring the company of books and films to that of his peers. But something about the magic of movies drew him in. He found solace in the silver screen, where men like Gary Cooper and John Wayne portrayed heroes who could silence the world with a single look. Clint saw something in those men, a strength, a confidence that he longed for. After high school, Clint enlisted in the Army during the Korean War, though he saw little combat. The military gave him structure, but it also deepened his sense of isolation. When his time in the service ended, Clint returned to California with little more than a suitcase full of dreams. It was the beginning of his Hollywood journey, but not one that would happen overnight. In the early 1950s, Clint's rise to fame was anything but smooth. He started off with bit parts in B-movies and TV shows, often cast as a cowboy or a tough guy. It was during these early years that he met several key figures who would shape his future, not just in Hollywood, but in ways he would never have expected. One of these figures was a man named Tony the Hammer Salvatore, a mysterious producer with connections to some of the most powerful figures in the criminal underworld. It was Tony who first introduced Clint to the idea that the world of Hollywood wasn't as clean as it appeared. Through Tony, Clint was introduced to a group of influential men who operated in the shadows, politicians, mobsters, and businessmen who controlled more than just the studios. They controlled Hollywood itself. Clint had never been fully aware of the mafia's grip on the industry, but he soon found himself walking a fine line. If he wanted to succeed, he had to play the game. And play it he did. But Clint had always been a man of principle, and that principle was tested time and time again. As his career soared, Clint found himself entangled in the world of crime and power brokers who operated far outside the law. Clint's career was forged on deals with people whose names were never mentioned in public. But the truth was, these were the people who made Clint Eastwood a household name. The connections Clint formed with the underworld helped propel his career to unimaginable heights, but they also came with a cost. The villa in Carmel was Clint's sanctuary. After decades of dealing with the pressures of Hollywood, the mafia, and the world's expectations of him, he had retreated to the peaceful, remote home to escape. It was a place where Clint could finally breathe, away from the cameras, away from the chaos of his past life. It was supposed to be his final resting place, a place where his secrets could remain hidden, where his legacy could be protected. But those secrets were not so easily buried. Sarah Jenkins had always admired Clint from afar. She grew up watching his films, the classic westerns and intense dramas that made him a legend. But as a detective, she knew better than most that the public image was often just that, an image. Clint Eastwood's carefully crafted persona as the tough, no-nonsense man of action didn't tell the whole story. There were cracks beneath the surface, cracks that Sarah had just begun to uncover. And the tunnel? That was just the tip of the iceberg. Sarah knew that finding the tunnel had to be more than just an oddity. It was no accident that it had been hidden beneath one of the most famous homes in California. This tunnel, these secrets, everything was connected. But to what? And who could be behind it all? Her mind raced as she stared at the map in her hands, tracing the intricate lines that led beneath the villa. The symbols, the codes, everything pointed to something far more significant than any of them had anticipated. She thought about Clint's past, the mafia connections, the secretive nature of his dealings, the world he had carefully constructed. But none of it explained the tunnel. The deeper she dug into Clint's past, the more she realized how little she truly knew about the man. His success, his wealth, his fame. All of it seemed to mask something darker, something far more dangerous. The truth about Clint Eastwood was buried under layers of secrets, and Sarah Jenkins was determined to unearth them all. As she walked through the villa, the quiet grandeur of the place felt almost suffocating. The walls, adorned with photographs and memorabilia, were reminders of Clint's legendary career. Yet, there was something about the atmosphere here that felt off, like the villa itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to break the silence. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was getting closer to something monumental. The tunnel, the map, the whispers of the mafia, they all pointed in one direction. But what exactly were they leading her to? Clint Eastwood had built a life of fame and fortune, but beneath it all, there were things that had never been meant to see the light of day. She had to know what was in that tunnel. She had to understand the connection between Clint Eastwood and the hidden secrets of his past. And she couldn't do it alone. The walls of the villa seemed to close in on her as Sarah made her way to the living room. Her phone buzzed again. It was another text from Mark. This time, the message was simple. "We need to talk. I think we've got a lead." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture was far from clear. Whatever had been hidden under Clint Eastwood's villa was about to be uncovered, and the fallout from this discovery would change everything. The days following the discovery of the tunnel were a whirlwind of activity and unanswered questions. Detective Sarah Jenkins had spent countless hours combing through old records, speaking with Clint Eastwood's former colleagues and friends, and tracking down any potential leads that might shed light on what lay beneath the villa. But each door she knocked on seemed to open into more mystery. The deeper she dug, the more she began to sense a pattern, a web of connections that had been carefully hidden, tied to Clint's rise to fame in ways that no one could have expected. The more Sarah thought about the map they had discovered in the tunnel, the more she became convinced that it wasn't just a relic from the past, it was a blueprint of something much larger. And it had to be linked to Clint's past. Every symbol, every cryptic marking on that map seemed to hint at something far more intricate than a mere secret passageway. Whatever Clint had been involved in, it was something bigger than just a Hollywood star. It was a network of people, organizations, and events that had been carefully orchestrated from the shadows. Her mind raced as she sat in her small office, the fluorescent light buzzing overhead. The walls, cluttered with case files and photographs, seemed to close in on her. She took a deep breath, pushing her thoughts back to the tunnel. What had they found? A hidden passage? Yes, but it was what lay beyond the entrance that kept her up at night. Sarah had visited the tunnel several times, but each time, something about it seemed more alive. The walls whispered with the dust of decades, the air felt heavier, as if the earth itself was unwilling to let go of its secrets. What was Clint hiding? Was it just his own personal past, or was it something far darker? Something tied to the world of crime and corruption that had surrounded Hollywood in the mid-20th century? She couldn't help but think back to what Mark Thompson had told her, the mafia connections that Clint had allegedly had. She had heard rumors over the years, but nothing concrete. After all, Clint Eastwood had always been a man of discretion, careful about keeping his personal life out of the public eye. But now, she was beginning to see a different side of him, one that the public had never been privy to. Mark had always been skeptical of Clint's public persona. He had worked on many high-profile cases, but Clint Eastwood's name always seemed to elude any hint of scandal or controversy. Yet, the deeper they dug, the more they started to connect dots that seemed to lead back to one name: Tony the Hammer Salvatore. The same man who had introduced Clint to Hollywood's underworld decades ago. Tony was known for his role in controlling a significant portion of the entertainment industry's shady dealings, but very few people knew just how far his influence stretched. Mark had managed to track down some old friends of Tony's. They were reluctant to speak at first, but after some careful persuasion, they had begun to share their stories. According to them, Tony Salvatore wasn't just a mobster. He was the linchpin in a much larger conspiracy, one that tied together Hollywood elites, powerful politicians, and the criminal underworld. And Clint Eastwood, it seemed, had been deeply involved in it all. It wasn't hard to see how Clint could have been pulled into this world. His rise to fame had been meteoric, and with that fame came the attention of people who controlled not just the studios, but the very fabric of Hollywood itself. Clint had always been a survivor, someone who could navigate the treacherous waters of fame without losing his edge. But the deeper Sarah looked into his past, the more she realized that Clint's survival might have come at a cost. As Sarah sat there, staring at the photos from Clint's earlier career, photos of him shaking hands with Tony Salvatore, attending parties with other notorious figures, she felt a chill run down her spine. Could Clint have been involved in something so much bigger than anyone realized? A secret network that stretched far beyond Hollywood, into the realm of politics, crime, and corruption? Her phone buzzed again. It was a message from Mark. "We've got something. Meet me at the villa. It's big." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. The tension in her chest mounted as she grabbed her coat and headed out the door. She didn't know what she was walking into, but she knew it couldn't be good. The more she uncovered, the more it seemed like Clint Eastwood's villa wasn't just a home. It was a fortress, a place where secrets had been buried for years. When Sarah arrived at the villa, she found Mark standing outside, looking anxious. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice sharp with anticipation. "We found something in the tunnel," Mark said, his voice low. He glanced over his shoulder to make sure no one was listening. "It's not just a tunnel, Sarah. It's part of a much larger network. There are other passages beneath this property, ones that lead to places I don't even want to think about." Sarah felt a wave of unease wash over her. "What kind of places?" Mark looked around nervously before answering. "I don't think this villa was just built for Clint. I think it was built for something else. It's a storage facility of sorts, a place where things were kept hidden. There's a room beneath the villa, Sarah, and whatever's in there, it's not just relics of Clint's past. It's something much darker." Sarah's mind was racing now, the pieces beginning to fall into place. Clint Eastwood, the man who had been Hollywood's golden boy, had created a life filled with secrets, and those secrets were buried right under his feet, hidden in a labyrinth of tunnels, maps, and locked rooms. But the real question was, what had he been protecting all these years? "We need to go in there," Sarah said, her voice determined. "Now." Mark nodded, and together, they made their way to the entrance of the tunnel. As they descended into the darkness once again, the air grew heavier, and Sarah felt a chill creep up her spine. Whatever was waiting at the end of this passage, she knew it would change everything. Clint Eastwood's legacy was built on a foundation of secrets, and now, those secrets were ready to be uncovered. The narrow tunnel felt suffocating. Every step Sarah Jenkins took echoed in the stillness, the walls closing in like an ancient beast lying in wait. The air was thick, heavy with dust and the faint smell of earth. As she and Mark descended further into the labyrinth beneath Clint Eastwood's villa, her heart raced. Whatever was hidden down here, Whatever secrets Clint had buried so deeply, she was about to uncover them. Mark was a few paces ahead, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. His face was tense, his eyes flicking from side to side as if anticipating something to jump out at him from the shadows. Sarah couldn't blame him. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. It wasn't just the physical sense of being underground. It was the weight of the history, the lies, and the unknown that pressed down on them. Every footstep felt like a step closer to something monumental. "How far does this go?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper, her words swallowed by the damp air. Mark stopped and turned, his flashlight beam catching the outline of his face. "Not sure. The map we found in the tunnel suggests there are several layers beneath this place, but the deeper you go, the more twisted it gets. Whatever's down here, it's not just Clint's secret, it's a legacy." Sarah nodded. Her thoughts swirled. The map had shown a series of passageways, each one seemingly leading to more hidden rooms and chambers. But what were they hiding? What was so dangerous that it had been locked away in this underground network for decades? As they reached a narrow, arched doorway at the end of the passage, Mark hesitated. "You sure you want to do this?" Sarah's gaze was unwavering. "We're already this far. We can't turn back now." He nodded and pushed open the door, revealing a large, dimly lit room. The flashlight beam swept across the space, revealing shelves of dusty books, old crates, and piles of documents. It looked like an archive, but there was something unsettling about the atmosphere. The room was filled with the remnants of Clint's past, his films, his career, and perhaps his ties to something far darker than anyone could have imagined. But Sarah's eyes were drawn to something else. In the far corner of the room, behind a stack of crates, was a large, iron door. It was unmarked, ancient-looking, and stood in stark contrast to everything else in the room. It seemed out of place, too solid, too permanent for a room that looked as though it hadn't been touched in decades. A chill ran down Sarah's spine. "That's it," Mark said quietly, his voice barely audible. "That's what we've been looking for." They approached the door cautiously. Sarah felt her pulse quicken as she reached for the cold metal handle, her hand trembling slightly. This was it. This was the moment when everything would change. They had uncovered Clint Eastwood's secret past, and now they were about to unlock it. But would they be prepared for what lay behind this door? The door creaked open slowly, revealing a small, dimly lit room. Sarah's flashlight illuminated the space, revealing walls lined with filing cabinets and more crates. But it wasn't the mundane office materials that caught her attention. It was the large, wooden chest at the center of the room, sealed tightly with old metal clasps. The chest seemed to hum with an energy all its own, as if it had been waiting for someone to open it for the first time in years. Mark stepped forward, his face pale. "What's in there?" he muttered under his breath. "Only one way to find out," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the rising tension. With a creaking sound that seemed far too loud for the silence surrounding them, Sarah knelt beside the chest and slowly began to undo the metal clasps. Her hands shook as she lifted the lid, revealing a stack of papers, old photographs, and what appeared to be several leather-bound journals. The moment she saw the journals, her breath caught in her throat. "These aren't just any papers," Sarah whispered. "These are personal journals. Clint's journals." Mark leaned in, inspecting the contents of the chest. This is bigger than we thought, Sarah. This is Clint Eastwood's life. All of it. His rise to fame, his ties to the underworld. Sarah carefully pulled out one of the journals, the leather cover worn from years of use. She opened it, scanning the first few pages. The handwriting was sharp, calculated, as though Clint had been writing with a purpose. His every word carefully crafted, each entry documenting moments of his life that he had never wanted anyone to know. As Sarah flipped through the pages, the words seemed to blur together, but one thing stood out. Names. Lots of names. Names of people she'd never heard of, people connected to Clint's Hollywood years, his rise to power, and perhaps more disturbingly, the connections that seemed to link him to powerful criminal figures. But it wasn't just the names that made Sarah's heart race. It was the tone of the writing, the fear in Clint's words, the secrecy he had cloaked himself in for so many years. There's more, Sarah said, almost to herself. This is the real Clint Eastwood, the man behind the mask. Mark glanced nervously around the room. What do we do now? We keep digging, Sarah said, a fire igniting in her chest. There's more to this, Mark. This chest is just the beginning. We need to follow these leads, connect the dots. Whatever Clint Eastwood was involved in, it's not over. And someone doesn't want us to find out the truth. As they sifted through the chest, a sudden realization hit Sarah. The deeper they went into Clint's past, the more they were uncovering. Secrets that had been buried for decades, hidden behind layers of lies and half-truths. But what did Clint Eastwood know? What had he been a part of? And why had he gone to such lengths to keep it all hidden? Before she could voice her thoughts, a loud noise echoed from somewhere deeper in the villa. Sarah and Mark froze, their hearts pounding. Someone was here. Did you hear that? Mark whispered urgently. Sarah didn't respond. She was already moving, grabbing the journals and shoving them into her bag. We need to leave. Now. As they hurried back toward the tunnel entrance, the air felt charged with an impending storm. The truth was closer than ever, but Sarah knew they weren't the only ones searching for it. Whoever had hidden Clint's secrets here wasn't going to let them get away without a fight. The sound of footsteps echoed in the distance, growing louder as Sarah and Mark moved swiftly through the narrow passageways of Clint Eastwood's villa. Each step they took felt like a heartbeat against the tension that clung to the air. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she glanced nervously over her shoulder, sensing that they weren't alone. The discovery of Clint's journals had been monumental, but now, with every second that passed, it felt like they were racing against an unseen enemy. Someone who would stop at nothing to protect the truth that had been buried beneath Clint's fame for so long. Mark, we need to move faster, Sarah whispered urgently, her breath quickening. Whoever's out there knows we're here. Mark nodded grimly, his face tense. He was clutching a flashlight in one hand and a stack of papers in the other. They had taken only the essentials, the journals and the most crucial documents that might help unravel the truth about Clint's past. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were playing a dangerous game now, one where the stakes were higher than they had ever imagined. They had entered a world that had been hidden for far too long, and now that world was closing in on them. As they emerged from the tunnel and into the villa's main hall, Sarah's mind raced. The journals in her bag felt heavier with each passing moment, the weight of the secrets they contained pressing down on her. What was Clint Eastwood hiding? And why had he kept these revelations locked away for so many years? Was it fear, guilt, or something else entirely that had driven him to bury the truth so deep? Mark turned to Sarah, his expression haunted. We need to figure out who else is involved in this. Clint's been involved with people we don't understand, and this goes far beyond the mafia ties. Whoever is covering up his past isn't just some random criminal. They've got power. I know, Sarah replied, her voice low. But the question is, who? And why does Clint matter so much to them? He's just an actor. Or at least that's what everyone thinks. But these journals, they tell a different story. They continued down the hall, but before they could reach the staircase, a door slammed open behind them. Sarah whipped around, her pulse racing, and saw a shadow emerge from the darkness. A man stepped into the light, his face familiar but unexpectedly menacing. It was Robert, Clint's longtime friend and business associate. His jaw was clenched, his eyes hard and cold. Thought you could get away with it, huh? Robert's voice was a low growl. You've been poking around in things you don't understand, Sarah. Now you're in over your head. Sarah took an instinctive step back, her hand instinctively moving toward her sidearm. But Mark was already stepping forward, his voice calm but forceful. We don't want trouble, Robert. We just want answers. Clint's secrets, they're buried in these tunnels. If you're involved, you need to come clean. This has gone too far. Robert's lips twisted into a thin smile, but there was no humor in it. Answers? You think Clint's got answers for you? No, Sarah. You don't get to just stumble in here and drag up all the ghosts he's worked so hard to keep hidden. Some things are better left buried. A chill ran down Sarah's spine. She could see it now. The fear in Robert's eyes, the desperation in his voice. He wasn't just trying to cover up Clint's past. He was trying to protect something far bigger. The truth they were seeking, the The truth Clint had hidden away for decades wasn't just dangerous for Clint. It was dangerous for everyone involved. "What are you protecting, Robert?" Sarah demanded, stepping forward herself. "What's so dangerous that it has to stay hidden?" Robert's eyes flicked toward the stairs, his gaze flickering for just a moment as if debating whether to make a run for it. But then he looked back at Sarah and Mark, his voice shaking. "You don't know what you're dealing with. If you keep digging, there's no going back. People, dangerous people, will come after you. After both of you." Before Sarah could respond, the sound of more footsteps reached her ears. This time, there were more of them. Too many to ignore. Robert's warning had been more than just a threat. It was a warning of something far more sinister. Someone was coming, and they were getting closer. "Robert, you're in too deep," Mark said, his voice low, filled with the weight of understanding. "Whatever Clint was involved in, it's bigger than both of us. And it's bigger than you. We have to stop it." For a moment, it seemed like Robert might say something more, but instead, he turned abruptly and dashed toward the back door. Sarah and Mark exchanged a look, both of them knowing that this wasn't the time to chase him down. They had to get out of there, and fast. "Let's go," Sarah said, grabbing Mark's arm. "We need to get back to the car. Now." They bolted through the villa's back door and out into the cool night air. The weight of what had just happened settled heavily on Sarah's shoulders. Robert knew more than he was letting on, but he wasn't about to be their ally. Whoever had been trying to bury Clint's past was out there, and they were closing in. As they reached the car, Sarah tossed the bag of journals onto the passenger seat and slammed the door shut. Mark started the engine, and they sped off into the night, the villa shrinking behind them. The answers they sought were within their grasp, but the cost of uncovering them was becoming clearer by the second. People were willing to kill to keep Clint Eastwood's secrets buried, and they would stop at nothing to protect them. But Sarah wasn't backing down. She had come too far to let fear stop her now. Whatever Clint Eastwood had been involved in, whatever he had hidden in those journals, it was all coming to light. And it wasn't just about Clint anymore. It was about uncovering a dark truth that had been buried for too long, one that would shake the very foundations of Hollywood, politics, and power itself. As Sarah gazed out the window into the night, she couldn't help but wonder, how far was she willing to go to find the truth? And more importantly, how far would they go to stop her? The night had a heavy, oppressive feel as Sarah and Mark drove away from Clint Eastwood's villa, the headlights of the car cutting through the darkness. The words of Robert still echoed in Sarah's mind. "People, dangerous people, will come after you. After both of you." She clenched her fists, trying to steady her breathing. The closer they got to the truth, the more dangerous it became. But she couldn't back down. Not now. Not when they were on the cusp of unraveling something bigger than they had ever imagined. Mark's hands were tight on the steering wheel, his jaw clenched in concentration. He was just as determined as she was, but even he could sense the weight of the situation. They had crossed a line, and now there was no turning back. The deeper they went, the more complicated the story became. Clint Eastwood had been hiding more than just his personal secrets. He had been hiding the skeletons of an entire world, one intertwined with power, corruption, and lies. "We need to find out who Robert was working with," Mark said, breaking the silence. His voice was steady, but there was an undercurrent of urgency. "There's someone, or something, behind all of this. If we can track them down, we'll get the answers we need." Sarah nodded. "I agree, but it's not just about answers anymore. This is bigger than Clint. It's about the people who are trying to bury this history forever, and we're not going to let them do it." The car cruised down the empty highway, the rhythmic hum of the tires on the road the only sound in the otherwise quiet night. Sarah's mind was racing. Every new piece of information they uncovered about Clint Eastwood's past seemed to lead to even more questions. The journals were a goldmine, but they had barely scratched the surface. She needed to understand why Clint had kept such a dangerous secret, why he had protected it so fiercely, and most importantly, what exactly had he been involved in all those years ago? As they drove, Sarah's thoughts kept returning to the journal entries she had skimmed earlier. The more she read, the clearer it became that Clint Eastwood was more than just a Hollywood icon. He had been part of something that had reached far beyond the silver screen. And whatever it was It had powerful people involved. People who didn't want this truth to see the light of day. "We need to go back to the beginning," Sarah said, her voice soft but firm. "Clint's career. His rise to fame. That's where we'll find the connection." Mark glanced at her, his eyes narrowing in thought. "You think his Hollywood connections are tied to whatever's going on?" "I don't think it's just Hollywood," she replied. "I think it's a network of people, businesses, and power players. Clint's role in that world was just the surface. He was a player, but not the only one." They pulled up to Sarah's apartment, the glow of the streetlights casting long shadows across the sidewalk. The tension in the air seemed to cling to them as they parked the car and stepped out. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that they weren't alone in this anymore. Whoever had been following them, whoever was behind Clint's buried past, they were close. Too close. Inside the apartment, Sarah set the bag containing Clint's journals on the kitchen table. The papers were crumpled from being stuffed into the bag so quickly, but they still held the answers she needed. She carefully opened the first journal again, scanning the pages as she had earlier. This time, she wasn't just looking for names. She was looking for patterns, connections, anything that might lead her to the truth. As she flipped through the pages, a series of entries caught her eye. Clint had written about a specific meeting, one that had taken place during the height of his career. The names in the entry were unfamiliar, but the context was clear. Clint had been in a position of power, surrounded by people who were involved in illegal activities. Politics, money laundering, blackmail. The deeper she read, the more it became apparent that Clint had been a part of something dangerous, something much darker than the public knew. "This isn't just about Clint anymore," Sarah said, more to herself than to Mark. "This is about a network. A web of people who have been hiding something for decades." Mark looked over her shoulder at the journal, his expression darkening as he read along. So, Clint was a pawn. But who was the mastermind behind all of this? Sarah's stomach twisted as the answer hit her like a punch to the gut. She looked up at Mark, her eyes wide with realization. "It's not just one person," she said slowly. "It's a group. A powerful group that's been using Clint to cover their tracks. He wasn't just an actor. He was a front, a way to keep everything clean. But now they're coming for us." Mark's face paled. "So we're not just up against Clint's past anymore. We're up against whoever's been running the show from behind the scenes." "Yes," Sarah said, her voice tinged with a new sense of resolve. "And it's not just about uncovering the truth anymore. It's about survival." The weight of the situation was becoming all too real. Sarah and Mark had started this journey seeking answers, but now they were entangled in a much larger conspiracy, one that reached into the highest echelons of power. They were up against people who had the resources and influence to bury the truth forever. But Sarah wasn't about to let that happen. She couldn't. Not after everything they had uncovered. "Do we have a plan?" Mark asked, breaking the silence. Sarah stood up, pacing as she thought. The pieces were all coming together, but there was still so much to uncover. They needed to get to the heart of this conspiracy, expose the people behind Clint's hidden life, and finally bring the truth to light. But there was no doubt in her mind that they would face resistance, violent, deadly resistance. "There's no turning back now," she said, stopping and turning to face Mark. "We push forward. We follow the trail wherever it leads. But we have to be careful. We have to be smart. Because if we make one wrong move, we won't just be fighting for the truth. We'll be fighting for our lives." Mark nodded, his eyes steady. "We're in this together." And with that, they both knew there was no going back. The truth was out there, hidden beneath layers of lies and deceit. And no matter what it took, they would expose it. As Sarah gazed out the window into the darkness, she could feel the storm approaching, the calm before the chaos. Whatever came next, she was ready to face it head-on. Because in the end, the truth had a way of coming to the surface. And when it did, nothing could stop it. The days following their discovery felt like they were living on borrowed time. Sarah and Mark worked tirelessly, diving deeper into Clint Eastwood's past and the mysterious web of people connected to his secrets. The more they unearthed, the clearer it became. Clint had been a central figure in something much darker than anyone had imagined. But it wasn't just Clint they had to worry about now. It was the people who had orchestrated this entire operation, the ones who had kept everything hidden for so long. They were no longer just two curious individuals trying to uncover a star's past. They were two people who had unknowingly stepped into a storm that was about to consume everything in its path. The first lead had come from a cryptic message hidden within one of Clint's journals. It wasn't much, just a name, Vega. No last name, no other clues, just that single word scribbled hastily at the end of an entry. But to Sarah, it was a clue. A breadcrumb that might lead them to the heart of the conspiracy. After all, why would Clint mention someone named Vega if they weren't important? Vega, Sarah said aloud, the word slipping off her tongue like a strange incantation. We need to find out who this is. Mark was sitting across from her at the kitchen table, his eyes glued to his laptop as he scrolled through a web of information. I'm on it. There's a few places we can check, but it's gonna take some time. Sarah nodded, not wanting to waste a second. They didn't have time to waste. The deeper they went, the more they realized how high the stakes had become, and the more Robert's warning echoed in her mind. Dangerous people were after them, people who didn't want them to uncover the truth. They had to stay ahead of them, no matter what. It wasn't long before they got their first break. Mark's eyes lit up as he clicked through an old news article. Got something. There's a record of a Vega tied to some underground political donations and shady business deals from decades ago. It's not much, but it's enough to get us started. Sarah leaned forward, her heart pounding. What kind of deals? And why is it connected to Clint? Mark scrolled down the article and frowned. These donations were tied to campaigns in the 1970s, politicians with links to criminal organizations, people in positions of power who could easily have buried the truth about Clint's connections. It doesn't make sense, unless Clint was involved in something even darker than we imagined. Whoever Vega is, they're a part of something huge, Sarah said, her voice tight with realization. We need to track them down. This is our chance to get answers. Mark nodded, his expression grim. But we have to be careful. Whoever Vega is, they're connected to powerful people. People who won't hesitate to silence us if we get too close. Sarah stood up, the tension in her shoulders growing with every passing moment. We don't have a choice. We have to find them. Now. The following day, they set out to track down Vega. They started with the small details, the businesses, the addresses, the names connected to the political donations. It was painstaking work, but Sarah knew that this was the only way. They couldn't afford to miss anything, no matter how small. After hours of research, they stumbled upon a lead that sent a chill down their spines. There was an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town that had been tied to a company that shared the same name as Vega's last known business partner. The connection was loose, but it was enough to make Sarah and Mark uneasy. They had no idea what they might find there, but they knew it was their best shot at getting closer to the truth. As they pulled up to the warehouse later that evening, the air felt thick with anticipation. The building loomed in front of them, its windows dark and unwelcoming. It was the kind of place that seemed abandoned. Yet Sarah had the distinct feeling that it wasn't completely empty. They weren't the only ones who had an interest in what lay inside. We should be careful, Mark said, his voice low as he glanced around. This feels wrong. I know, Sarah replied, her gaze never leaving the warehouse. But we have to do this. We're so close. They made their way toward the back of the building, their footsteps muffled by the damp ground. The door was ajar, just enough for them to slip inside without making a sound. Sarah's heart raced as she stepped over the threshold, Mark following closely behind her. The inside of the warehouse was dark, the faint sound of dripping water echoing through the empty space. There were boxes stacked high along the walls, old crates and rusted machinery scattered haphazardly. It looked like a place that had been forgotten by time, yet there was something about it that made Sarah uneasy. Something that told her this was no ordinary abandoned warehouse. They crept further into the darkness, their flashlights cutting through the shadows. Suddenly, Sarah froze. A faint noise, a scuffle, came from deeper within the building. Her hand instinctively went to her sidearm, the familiar weight of the gun grounding her in the moment. Stay close, she whispered to Mark. They continued moving cautiously, the air growing colder the further they went. It wasn't until they reached the far end of the warehouse that they found what they had been looking for. A door, half hidden behind a stack of crates, stood slightly ajar. Through the small crack, Sarah could see dim light spilling out. Voices. Conversations. She motioned for Mark to follow her, and they slipped through the door as quietly as possible. What they saw next made Sarah's blood run cold. Inside, a group of men and women sat around a large table. They were dressed in dark suits, their faces hardened and cold. Sarah recognized some of them. Politicians, business tycoons, people who had been involved in the shady dealings she had read about in Clint's journals. But there was something else. In the center of the room, sitting at the head of the table, was someone she didn't expect. It was Robert. He was no longer just a former friend of Clint's. He was a part of this underground network, this criminal web that had been hiding in plain sight all these years. And it wasn't just Clint they were protecting. It was a legacy built on lies, money, and power. "Robert," Sarah whispered, her breath catching in her throat. This was bigger than they had ever imagined. The conspiracy they had uncovered was just the tip of the iceberg. Mark's voice was low and urgent. "We need to get out of here. Fast." But it was too late. The door behind them creaked, and Sarah's heart skipped a beat. They weren't alone anymore. The sound of footsteps behind them shattered the fragile silence. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she turned toward Mark, panic creeping into her thoughts. They had been discovered. There was no time to think, no time to plan. All they had was the raw instinct to survive. "Go," Sarah whispered, barely able to keep her voice steady. "We have to get out of here now." Mark nodded, his face as pale as hers. Without a word, they turned and bolted toward the back of the warehouse, adrenaline pumping through their veins. Their footsteps were loud, echoing through the cavernous building, but they couldn't slow down. They had to move faster. The risk of getting caught was too great. Behind them, the voices had started to rise in volume, their tones shifting from casual conversation to urgent commands. It didn't take long for Sarah to realize they weren't alone. The people in that room, Robert, the politicians, the business magnates, weren't just involved in a shady business deal. They were a part of something much larger, something criminal, and they weren't going to let Sarah and Mark get away with it. Sarah's mind raced, trying to formulate a plan even as they sprinted through the darkness. The only exit was the way they had come in, through the back door. But as they approached it, the sound of a car engine roared to life outside. The hair on the back of Sarah's neck stood on end. They were trapped. "Left," Mark shouted, pointing to a narrow alley that veered off to the side. Without hesitating, Sarah veered toward the alley, hoping it would lead to some kind of escape route. The alley was dark, the walls of the warehouse pressing in on them as they ran. They could hear the sound of feet pounding behind them, and the growing engine noise suggested that someone was already in pursuit. There was no way they could outrun them on foot, not with the warehouse so vast and their pursuers closing in. "We need a car," Sarah said between breaths, her voice tight. She wasn't sure where they would find one, but it was the only option they had. "We don't have time for that," Mark replied, his eyes scanning the alley for an escape route. "We need to keep moving." They ran for what felt like an eternity, rounding corners, ducking through narrow spaces between buildings. The alley twisted and turned, each new passageway seeming to offer a temporary hope of escape before leading to yet another dead end. Sarah's chest burned, the weight of their situation closing in on her. They couldn't keep this up for much longer. Suddenly, Mark grabbed her arm and pulled her to a stop. "Look," he said, pointing down a street ahead. "A car. It's just parked there. We can make it." The car was a few hundred yards away, parked in the shadows. It wasn't much, but it was their only chance. Sarah's heart skipped a beat as they took off running again, pushing their bodies to the limit. The sound of footsteps behind them had grown louder, the urgency in the pursuers' movements clear. They were getting closer. With one last burst of speed, Sarah reached the car first. She yanked on the door handle, but it didn't open. Locked. She cursed under her breath and turned to Mark, who was quickly catching up. He tried the door next, his fingers fumbling in the cold. "It's locked," he said, frustrated. "We don't have time for this." Sarah's voice was hoarse as she scanned the area. The car wasn't just their lifeline. It was their only lifeline. Desperation rose within her. Mark paused for a moment, thinking, before pulling something out of his jacket. "I've got an idea. Just keep an eye on the street." Before she could ask what he meant, Mark was already working on the car's window. Within seconds, he had used a small device to unlock the door. Sarah opened it and jumped into the driver's seat without hesitation, her hands shaking with adrenaline. "Get in," she yelled at Mark. He scrambled into the passenger seat, slamming the door shut just as a shadow loomed in the alleyway behind them. The sound of tires screeching filled the night air as Sarah threw the car into gear and peeled out of the parking space. The car jerked forward, the headlights illuminating the alley behind them. But as she sped down the street, she could see the figures emerging from the darkness, chasing after them. "Go faster," Mark shouted, his voice frantic. "We've got to lose them." Sarah's foot slammed onto the accelerator, and the car lurched forward. The streets ahead of them blurred as she pushed the vehicle to its limits. Her knuckles were white on the steering wheel, but she couldn't afford to lose focus. Every second counted. Behind them, the sound of a car engine revving told Sarah that their pursuers weren't far behind. They had been too close, too aware. Whoever these people were, they weren't going to let Sarah and Mark leave without consequences. But they couldn't afford to let up. The chase was on. The city streets rushed by in a blur, the glow of the streetlights flashing in the rearview mirror as Sarah tried to shake their pursuers. Her pulse was racing, the adrenaline crashing over her in waves. She could feel the pressure building, the fear threatening to choke her. Every turn they made felt like a gamble. She didn't dare look behind her to see if they were still being followed, but the sound of screeching tires and honking horns told her everything she needed to know. They were gaining on them. "We're not going to outrun them on these streets," Mark said urgently. "You need to find a way to lose them." Sarah's mind worked furiously, her eyes scanning for an opening. She had to think. She had to act. Ahead, there was a bridge, the kind of bridge that arched over the freeway, leading into a quieter part of town. The traffic on it was sparse, a perfect opportunity to throw off their pursuers. But she only had one shot at this. "Hold on," she warned Mark as she swerved the car toward the bridge, accelerating even faster. The tires screeched as she cut across lanes, narrowly avoiding other vehicles. She could see the bridge up ahead, a narrow escape route, but would it be enough? With one last push, they hit the ramp that led to the bridge. Sarah slammed the car into overdrive, praying they would make it to the other side before the men chasing them could catch up. For a brief, fleeting moment, everything seemed to hold its breath. And then, as they neared the top of the bridge, the sound of tires spinning in pursuit faded. They were free. The car finally slowed to a stop on the far side of the bridge, its engine sputtering from the relentless speed. Sarah turned off the ignition and slumped in her seat, hands trembling as she gripped the steering wheel. For the first time in hours, she allowed herself a moment to breathe, her chest rising and falling in shallow, rapid gasps. The rush of the chase, the constant fear. They were both too much to handle. And yet, as she looked over at Mark, the knot in her stomach tightened again. They were safe, for now. But she couldn't shake the feeling that they were only at the beginning of something much larger, something they were no longer in control of. "We did it," Mark breathed, leaning back in his seat, a shaky laugh escaping his lips, but his eyes were far from relieved. Instead, they were filled with disbelief. "Barely," Sarah muttered, her mind still racing. "But we're not out of the woods yet. We're being hunted, Mark. These people are dangerous." "I know," Mark said softly, his voice low, his face drawn with the weight of their situation. "But what's next? Where do we go from here?" Sarah didn't answer right away. Where could they go? Who could they trust? Every lead they followed seemed to dig them deeper into a hole they didn't know how to climb out of. They were up against a shadowy network of powerful figures, some of whom they knew: Robert, Clint, and now, this mysterious Vega. All of them interconnected by secrets that spanned decades. What had Clint gotten involved in? And what did it have to do with them? "Clint," she muttered under her breath, running a hand through her disheveled hair. She had to focus. "We need to find out everything about him. This whole thing started with him, and it's the only way we'll get to the heart of what's going on." Mark nodded. "I think you're right. But how? We don't even know who we can trust anymore." Right now, we trust each other, Sarah said firmly, glancing at him with determination. We have to, because if we don't, we're as good as dead. She stared ahead at the dark, empty road. A part of her longed for safety, for something familiar. But there was no going back now. The door had opened, and they were already deep into a maze of deceit and danger. A chill settled over the car as the night stretched on, the quiet hum of the engine filling the space between them. Sarah couldn't ignore the dread gnawing at the back of her mind. They weren't just searching for the truth. They were uncovering something far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. And the deeper they went, the more they realized just how high the stakes were. Suddenly, her phone buzzed, breaking the stillness. Sarah glanced at the screen, her heart skipping a beat. It was a text from Robert. You're out of your depth. This is bigger than Clint, bigger than both of us. If you want answers, come to the old mansion at the edge of town. But be warned, you're not the only ones looking for answers. For a moment, Sarah felt the weight of those words settle like lead in her chest. Robert knew they were digging, knew they were getting too close. And now, he was offering them a way in, or perhaps a way out. But could they trust him? After everything that had happened, after all the lies, could they afford to trust anyone? What is it? Mark asked, his voice tense. It's Robert, Sarah replied, her voice tight. He's asking us to meet him. At the old mansion. He says it's the only way to get answers. Mark frowned, his eyes narrowing. I don't know if we should trust him. He's been hiding something from us this whole time. What if this is a trap? Sarah exhaled sharply, glancing down at the phone. The weight of the decision hung heavy between them. They were running out of options, and the longer they waited, the more dangerous it became. I don't know, she whispered, her mind in turmoil. But we can't stop now. If we don't go, we'll never know what's really going on. And if Robert is the key to understanding all of this, we need to take that chance. Are you sure? Mark asked, his voice quieter now, the urgency replaced by a sense of fear. What if it's too late? What if the people we're running from are already ahead of us? Sarah's heart tightened, and she stared out at the desolate landscape before them. The mansion was a symbol of everything they had uncovered so far. Decay, corruption, power. But it was also the key. If they wanted to unravel the truth, they would have to walk straight into the lion's den. I'm sure, she said finally, meeting his gaze. We don't have a choice. Mark nodded slowly, the apprehension clear in his eyes. But he didn't argue. They were in this together, and they both knew that the only way out was forward. The drive to the mansion felt like it took hours, even though it was only a short distance. The road was empty, the silence between them pressing in like a suffocating weight. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that every mile brought them closer to a trap. The mansion loomed on the horizon, an eerie silhouette against the dark sky. When they finally reached the mansion, it was even more imposing than Sarah had imagined. The massive, crumbling structure seemed to whisper secrets, the windows dark and vacant. The gates were open, but that only made Sarah feel more uneasy. It was too quiet, too still. As they drove up the long, winding path to the front door, Sarah's thoughts raced. What was Robert planning? What would they find when they stepped inside? They pulled up to the front steps, and Sarah killed the engine. The mansion stood in front of them, its broken windows staring down at them like eyes in the dark. The air was thick with tension. Ready? Mark asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah nodded, but her gut told her everything they were about to face would change everything. As they stepped out of the car, the door to the mansion creaked open, and Robert stood in the doorway. But there was no comfort in his presence, only more questions. Come in, he said, his voice low. I have a feeling you'll need all the answers you can get. Sarah and Mark hesitated for only a moment before stepping into the dimly lit hallway of the mansion. The air inside was stale, and the creaking wooden floors beneath their feet only added to the feeling of unease that had settled over them. The place seemed like it hadn't been touched in decades, its grandeur faded, and yet there was something oddly compelling about it, a sense of history and power that lingered in every corner. Robert motioned for them to follow as he led them deeper into the mansion. His presence was unsettling, The man who had once seemed so confident now appearing more like a ghost, weighed down by the knowledge he held. Sarah couldn't help but wonder how much of the truth he was keeping from them, how many layers of deception they would have to peel away to finally understand what they were up against. He stopped in front of a large, ornate door at the end of the hallway, pushing it open with an almost rehearsed gesture. Inside, the room was more modern than the rest of the mansion, with sleek furniture and soft lighting. A large desk sat at the center, covered with papers and files, and in the corner stood an old, worn-out filing cabinet that seemed out of place in the otherwise well-kept room. "Sit," Robert said, gesturing toward the two chairs in front of the desk. "I'll explain everything." As they sat, Sarah's mind raced. She had no idea what Robert would reveal, but her gut told her it would be something monumental. They had crossed a line tonight, and there was no going back. Whatever he said next would change everything. Robert took a seat across from them, his expression grim. He folded his hands together, resting his elbows on the desk. For a moment, there was only silence, the weight of the moment pressing on them all. "Do you know what Clint Eastwood's true legacy is?" Robert asked suddenly, his eyes narrowing as he looked from Sarah to Mark. Mark blinked, clearly thrown off by the question. "His films, his reputation as a legendary actor." "Those are only parts of the story," Robert interrupted, shaking his head. Clint Eastwood was more than just a star. He was part of something far bigger, something he never wanted the public to know. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "What are you talking about?" Robert leaned back in his chair, his eyes clouded with regret. Clint Eastwood was involved in the development of a secret network, one that spans far beyond the entertainment industry. He was connected to a group of powerful individuals who used their influence for personal gain: politicians, business moguls, and people who controlled the most important parts of the country. It wasn't just about money. It was about power, control, and keeping the truth hidden at any cost. Clint was part of all that? Mark asked, his voice filled with disbelief. But he was a hero, a symbol of strength and integrity. "That was the facade," Robert replied. "He played the role well, didn't he? But the man you saw in the movies wasn't the man he truly was. Clint was a part of a syndicate that thrived on secrecy, manipulation, and deceit. His villa was just one of many fronts for their operations. That tunnel you found, it wasn't just for storage. It was the beginning of something bigger. And now, you two are part of it." Sarah's mind reeled. Clint's villa had been hiding a secret tunnel, and now she understood that it wasn't just a historical relic. It was a link to an underground world of power and corruption. But why had Clint been involved? What had driven him to join forces with people like Robert and the others? But why did Clint get involved in all this? Sarah pressed, her voice shaking slightly as the gravity of the situation hit her. What was his role? Robert's face darkened, and he sighed, leaning forward. Clint didn't have a choice. He was born into this world. His family had ties to the network for generations. The truth is, Clint's career was a carefully crafted distraction, a way to hide his true involvement. And now, everything he built is coming apart. The people who control this operation, Vega, Robert, the others, they don't want the truth to come out. They'll do anything to silence anyone who gets too close. Vega? Mark echoed. Who is Vega? I don't know, Robert admitted. Vega is the shadow, the person behind the person, the one who pulls the strings and stays hidden in the background. But I've heard rumors. Some say he's a politician. Others think he's part of the military-industrial complex. Whoever he is, Vega has been orchestrating everything from the beginning. And now he's going after you two because you're too close to uncovering the truth. Sarah's head spun. She had thought that getting to Clint would lead them to answers, but it seemed they were still in the dark. Whoever Vega was, they had to find him before he found them. We've been running blind, haven't we? Sarah said, her voice steadying as she processed the information. Everything we thought we knew, it's all a lie. It's worse than that, Robert said. The network isn't just about power. It's about controlling history itself. Clint and his partners were working to rewrite the past, erase certain events, manipulate others. The tunnel beneath his villa was part of that plan. A secret vault, hidden in plain sight, containing documents, evidence, and resources to manipulate the global narrative. Mark's face twisted in confusion. Are you saying they were rewriting history? Robert nodded gravely. Exactly. This network was working to control information, to change what the public thought they knew about the world. And Clint, he was their most valuable asset. His fame gave them access to people, to influence. And when he tried to pull away, they came for him. Sarah stood up suddenly, her mind racing. This was bigger than she could have ever imagined. If what Robert was saying was true, they were up against something far more dangerous than they had ever anticipated. So what now? Mark asked, his voice low and uncertain. What do we do with this information? Robert stood too, his face grim. We go after Vega. We bring down the network. But we can't do it alone. You two have a role to play, whether you like it or not. The clock is ticking, and if we don't act now, they'll bury us all. Sarah and Mark exchanged a look, both of them understanding the same truth. They couldn't walk away now. Not when they were this close to the answers. Not when everything they had worked for had led them to this moment. The truth was out there, buried beneath layers of lies, secrets, and betrayal. And they had no choice but to keep digging until they uncovered every last piece. As they turned to leave the room, Sarah couldn't help but feel a shift inside her. The darkness had enveloped them, yes, but somewhere in that darkness, there was a glimmer of hope. They were close. So close to finally seeing everything for what it truly was. And they weren't going to stop. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The mansion was silent as Sarah and Mark left Robert's office. The weight of what they had just learned hung heavy on their shoulders. Clint Eastwood, a man who had been a symbol of strength and integrity, was nothing more than a cog in a massive, shadowy machine that controlled the world from the shadows. The truth had been laid bare, but it only raised more questions. The network, the documents, the secret tunnel beneath Clint's villa, it all led to something much larger than they had ever imagined. Vega, the puppet master behind it all, remained an enigma, and Sarah knew that their time was running out. Robert's warning echoed in her mind. The clock is ticking. They needed to act quickly, before they became the next targets in this web of deceit and manipulation. Sarah glanced at Mark, who was walking beside her. His face was a mixture of disbelief and fear, but there was determination in his eyes now. He wasn't going to back down. We need to get to that vault, Sarah said, her voice steady but urgent. The documents Clint was hiding, the evidence. If we can find it, we can expose this whole thing. We can end it. Mark nodded, though his expression was still clouded with doubt. But where do we even start? We don't know where the vault is, or if it's still there. And for all we know, Vega's already ahead of us. Sarah took a deep breath. She knew Mark was right. Every step they took seemed to lead them deeper into a maze with no clear exit. But they couldn't give up. Not now. Not after everything they had uncovered. Robert mentioned something about a secondary location, Sarah said, recalling their conversation. There's another property, somewhere isolated. He said it was used as a backup. We have to get there. Another mansion? Mark asked, arching an eyebrow. No, something more hidden. A place even more secure. It's where they kept the most sensitive files, she said, her mind racing. I'm willing to bet that's where we'll find the answers we need. If we can get to that place, we'll have the leverage to go after Vega. Do you think Robert's telling the truth? Mark asked. I mean, we know he's been involved in this for years, but how do we know he's not leading us into another trap? Sarah hesitated, her thoughts drifting back to Robert's worn-out face, the look in his eyes when he had spoken about Clint. He had seemed genuine, but then again, they couldn't afford to trust anyone completely. I don't know, she admitted, but we don't have many choices left. We have to take the risk. Mark nodded, though the uncertainty remained on his face. Okay, but what about the people who are after us? The ones Robert warned us about? How do we get around them? We stay low, Sarah replied, her voice firm. We move fast, and we keep our eyes open. We don't know who's watching us, but if we stay one step ahead, we can make it. As they approached the front doors of the mansion, Sarah stopped, turning to face Mark. Listen, I know this is dangerous. I know we're up against something we can't fully understand yet, but we have to see this through. If we back down now, it's over." Mark met her gaze, and for a moment, she could see the conflict in his eyes. But then something shifted, a resolve, a sense of purpose. He wasn't going to let fear stop them. He was in this for the long haul, just like her. "Let's do it," he said, his voice steady. With that, they both turned and walked toward the car. The night was growing darker, the shadows of the mansion stretching long behind them. The world around them felt quiet, too quiet, but they both knew better. Silence didn't mean safety. It meant danger was lurking. As Sarah drove, her mind remained focused on their goal. They needed to get to the backup location before anyone else did. They couldn't let Vega, or anyone else, get their hands on the files first. But as they navigated through the winding streets, Sarah's thoughts kept returning to Robert. Had he really been trying to help them? Or had he been manipulating them all along? He had warned them about the danger of going after Vega, but what if he was just trying to cover his own tracks? "There's a lot we don't know," Sarah said, breaking the silence in the car. "Yeah, like who we can trust," Mark replied, his voice tinged with bitterness. "This whole thing has turned into a mess, and I'm not sure we'll be able to clean it up." "We'll clean it up by going straight to the source," Sarah said, her grip tightening on the steering wheel. "If we find the vault, if we expose what Clint and the others were hiding, we can take them down. We just have to stay ahead of the game." The drive felt endless, but eventually, they arrived at a secluded area, far from the bustling city they had left behind. The air was thick with tension, and the trees surrounding them seemed to block out the rest of the world. It was the perfect place to hide something, too perfect, in fact. They parked the car in a clearing and approached a tall iron gate that marked the entrance to an overgrown driveway. There were no signs, no markers, just the looming shadow of the place ahead. "This is it," Sarah said, her voice low. She could feel the danger now, thick in the air. Mark glanced around nervously. "You sure this is the right place?" "Feels wrong." "I'm sure," Sarah said, her eyes scanning the darkened surroundings. "This is where the answers are. We just need to get inside." The gate was locked, but Sarah quickly found the old rusted key hidden in a small box beneath a pile of leaves. It wasn't exactly secure, but it had been enough to keep away anyone who wasn't supposed to be there. With a deep breath, Sarah unlocked the gate, and they stepped onto the path that led them toward the mansion, if it could even be called that. The place was a dilapidated ruin, overgrown with ivy and moss. It looked abandoned, forgotten by time. But Sarah knew better. This place had been kept hidden for a reason. Whatever was inside, it would lead them one step closer to the truth. "Stay alert," Sarah murmured to Mark, as they both approached the entrance. Every sense in her body screamed that they weren't alone. As the door creaked open, Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. The answers were waiting inside, but so were the consequences of their search, and they were ready to face them, whatever it took. The air inside the abandoned mansion felt stale and thick with dust as Sarah and Mark stepped inside, their footsteps echoing through the empty halls. The heavy silence pressed against them, and the further they ventured into the building, the more oppressive it felt. It was as though the place itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. As they moved deeper into the dark, labyrinthine hallways, Sarah's mind raced. What had Clint been involved in? And why had Robert sent them here, of all places? Everything about this situation felt off, but they didn't have the luxury of second-guessing themselves. Time was running out. Vega and his network were hunting them, and they had to find something, anything, that could help them put an end to this madness. Mark's voice broke through her thoughts, low and tense. "Sarah, this place feels like it's been abandoned for years. You sure this is the right place?" "I'm sure," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the unease curling in her gut. "This is where Clint kept his backup files." "It has to be." Mark hesitated but followed her, though he kept glancing around, every creak and rustle seeming to unsettle him more. "I don't know. Something about all this. It doesn't add up." Sarah nodded, understanding his doubt. But she couldn't afford to be scared now, not when they were so close. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the map they'd found earlier, a faint, yellowed diagram of the mansion with markings indicating a hidden door leading down to a cellar-like area. It was their only lead, and they had no choice but to trust it. As they moved through the darkened hallways, the weight of history seemed to hang in the air, and Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The cold, musty scent of decay mixed with something far more sinister. An electric charge in the air that sent goosebumps prickling across her skin. Finally, they reached the spot marked on the map. The floor here was different. A section of the wood seemed out of place, as though it could be lifted. Sarah's heart raced as she crouched down, brushing the dust aside and pulling at the floorboard. It was heavy, but with a grunt, she managed to pry it up. Beneath it, there was a metal hatch, old but sturdy, rusted at the edges. "This is it," she whispered, her breath quickening with anticipation. They had found it. This was the doorway to the hidden secrets of Clint's world. Mark's eyes were wide as he looked down at the hatch. "What do you think is down there?" "I don't know," Sarah admitted, "but I'm betting it's the evidence we need." With a deep breath, she gripped the handle and pulled the hatch open. The sound of the metal scraping against the stone floor sent a shiver through her. The darkness beneath them seemed to stretch on endlessly, swallowing up the light. "We're going in," Sarah said, trying to steady her voice. Mark nodded, though he didn't speak. They had no other choice now but to face whatever awaited them below. They descended into the darkness, the air growing colder with each step. The stairs creaked underfoot, and Sarah's hand gripped the railing tightly as she tried to maintain her balance in the dim light. The smell down here was sharper, musty, with the faint scent of damp earth. It was clear that no one had been here in a long time. At the bottom of the stairs, the tunnel stretched out before them, lit only by the weak flashlight Sarah held. The walls were lined with shelves, and the place had the eerie, forgotten feeling of a secret archive. Papers were stacked high in some corners, and old, weathered boxes were piled haphazardly. But it wasn't the clutter that caught Sarah's attention. It was the feeling, the sense that something was waiting here, something that had been buried for far too long. "What do you think all this is?" Mark's voice was barely a whisper. "I think this is everything," Sarah said, her eyes scanning the shelves. Clint's secrets, the files they didn't want anyone to find. She stepped forward, reaching for one of the boxes, her fingers trembling slightly. As she lifted it down, she saw a faded label on the side, Project Vega. Her heart skipped a beat. "This is it," she whispered. "This is what we've been looking for." Mark stepped up beside her, his eyes wide with disbelief. "What do you mean? What is it?" Sarah carefully opened the box, revealing a stack of documents inside. She pulled the top one free and unfolded it, scanning the text. What she read sent a chill through her body. The file was a collection of reports, dates, names, and locations. It detailed covert operations that went back years, decades, even. Operations tied to the most powerful players in the world. But there was more. The papers also contained notes on Clint's involvement, descriptions of meetings, and the coded language that had been used to mask the true nature of their plans. "What is this?" Mark asked, his voice trembling. "This is the proof," Sarah said, her voice shaking with excitement. Clint wasn't just an actor. He was a key player in an international conspiracy. A conspiracy that goes all the way to the top. This is how they controlled everything, from politics to business. This is what Vega was protecting. Mark took a step back, his face pale. "You mean Clint wasn't just playing a role in the movies? He was actually involved in something like this?" "I'm afraid so," Sarah said, her mind spinning. "And it looks like he was trying to stop it. That's why he hid this stuff. He tried to back out, but they wouldn't let him." As she continued to go through the papers, Sarah felt a wave of nausea wash over her. The documents were far more damning than she had imagined. This was a network of corruption, spanning continents, infiltrating governments, and manipulating the very fabric of society. Clint had known too much, and in the end, it seemed he had paid the price for trying to expose the truth. But now they had it. Now they had the evidence. Sarah looked up at Mark, her face grim. "We need to get out of here. We can't stay too long. They'll come for us soon." As they gathered the papers, the tension in the air grew palpable. They had what they needed, But now they had to leave, and fast. The walls around them seemed to close in, as if the very mansion itself was conspiring to trap them. But it wasn't just the mansion they had to worry about anymore. With the documents in their hands, they had become targets in the war for control. The network they were up against wouldn't let them go easily. They were deeper in this fight than ever before, and the true battle was just beginning. The moment Sarah and Mark exited the hidden tunnel, their hearts pounded with adrenaline. They had what they came for: Clint Eastwood's secret files, the evidence that could bring down the global network that had manipulated so many. But as they emerged into the cold night air, they felt an unmistakable weight bearing down on them. It wasn't just the burden of the documents. It was the unsettling feeling that their victory had already cost them more than they realized. The outside world felt eerily quiet. The mansion, once imposing, now seemed like an abandoned relic of a past they were no longer a part of. Mark glanced around nervously, his face pale from the hours they'd spent underground, his hands shaking slightly. "We've got to get out of here," Sarah said, her voice steady but tight with urgency. "We can't stay. Not with those documents." Mark nodded, his mind clearly racing. "Right. But where do we go? Who do we trust now?" It was the question that had been lingering at the back of Sarah's mind ever since they first learned about Clint's involvement in the dark network. They had fought so hard to uncover the truth, but now that they had it, the reality of what it meant was starting to sink in. Their only option was to take the documents to someone who could protect them and expose everything. But who could they trust? Robert had seemed genuine, but had he been using them all along? Had he orchestrated the whole thing to get them into this position? She didn't know anymore. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps broke through the stillness of the night. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She whipped her head toward the direction of the noise, instinctively pulling Mark back toward the shadows. "Get down," she whispered urgently. They crouched low, hiding behind a large tree near the edge of the property, holding their breath. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Through the gaps in the leaves, Sarah's eyes widened as she saw a familiar figure stepping into the clearing. It was Robert. "What the hell is he doing here?" Mark muttered under his breath, his voice tinged with suspicion. Sarah didn't answer. Her mind was racing, trying to process what was happening. Why had Robert come here? Was he following them? Or had he known all along where they were going to be? Robert's form was illuminated by the moonlight, his face unreadable as he glanced around the mansion's grounds. His hand was tucked into his coat, the same way it had been when they last spoke. He seemed alert, cautious, like he was hunting for something or someone. "Stay here," Sarah said softly, her voice barely a whisper. She didn't want to risk making a sound. "I'll go see what he's up to." Before Mark could protest, Sarah stood up, creeping quietly from the shadows. Her every step felt heavy, the sound of her boots on the ground muffled by the thick grass. As she approached Robert, she stayed in the shadows, keeping her distance but maintaining her view of him. He was too close now, too close to the truth. She waited until he was just a few feet away before stepping out of the dark and calling his name. "Robert!" He spun around, his face suddenly tightening with surprise. His hand moved toward his coat, and Sarah instinctively braced herself. But instead of pulling a weapon, Robert lowered his hand and let out a breath. "Sarah? Mark?" He sounded genuinely surprised. "What are you two doing here?" "We could ask you the same thing," Sarah replied, keeping her tone guarded. Robert's eyes flickered briefly to the papers clutched in her hand before he quickly regained his composure. "I should have known you'd find it. I didn't think you'd make it this far. Why are you here?" Mark called out, his voice sharp as he stepped out of the shadows, clearly not trusting Robert. Robert's gaze flicked to Mark, but his expression softened, his posture easing just a fraction. "I never wanted it to come to this," he said quietly, "but I couldn't let you two go on without knowing the full truth. I didn't want to keep you in the dark any longer." Sarah felt a chill run through her. There it was, the moment when everything they'd worked for seemed about to unravel. "The truth?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What truth?" Robert's eyes dropped to the ground. He hesitated, the weight of what he was about to say clearly pressing down on him. "You don't know everything. You don't know what Clint was trying to protect. And I didn't know who to trust until now. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. There was something in his voice, something that didn't sit right. What are you saying? Mark demanded. We're risking our lives, going through hell, and you're telling us now that we don't know the whole story? Robert lifted his gaze, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something else in his eyes. Something colder. You're right. You don't know the whole story. The network you've uncovered, the people behind it, they're more powerful than you can imagine. And Clint was always part of the plan. Sarah's stomach churned. What do you mean? Robert took a deep breath, his eyes locking onto hers. Clint wasn't trying to stop the network. He was part of it, but he wanted control. He thought he could break free, but he couldn't. And when he tried to get out, when he tried to expose them, they came after him. Mark's face went pale, and Sarah felt her legs weaken beneath her. You're saying Clint wasn't the hero? No, Robert said, shaking his head. Clint was never the hero. He was a pawn, just like the rest of us. The words hit Sarah like a blow to the chest. Everything she thought she knew about Clint, the man she had admired, the actor who had inspired generations, was nothing but a lie. The man they had trusted to lead them to the truth was just as much a part of the conspiracy as anyone else. And now, they were standing in front of the man who had orchestrated it all. The realization hit her like a freight train. They had been played. And worse, they had been walking into a trap set by Robert himself. Before she could react, Robert's hand slid into his coat again. But this time, there was a glint of metal. The betrayal had come full circle. The metallic gleam in Robert's hand reflected the dim moonlight, and Sarah's heart skipped a beat. His eyes never left hers as he slowly revealed the weapon. The cold steel a stark reminder of the danger they were now in. The betrayal was undeniable. Everything had led to this moment. Mark stepped forward, his eyes locked on the gun. What are you doing, Robert? His voice was firm but laced with disbelief. We trusted you. Robert's gaze flickered briefly toward Mark, but he didn't lower the gun. Instead, his lips curled into a grim smile, the expression one of resolve. Trust? You think you could trust anyone in a game like this? His voice was low, barely a whisper, as if he were speaking to himself. I tried to protect you both. I tried to shield you from this world, but you insisted on digging. You insisted on finding the truth. Clint was never the hero? Sarah's voice wavered as she repeated the words he had just spoken. You expect us to believe that? I'm not asking you to believe anything, Robert shot back. Clint was a pawn in a bigger game. And you were too, Sarah. You're all just players, manipulated by forces you can't even begin to understand. The weight of his words hung heavy in the air. Sarah's chest tightened, her breaths shallow. She wanted to fight back, wanted to scream that he was lying, that he was just another piece of the puzzle she had to solve. But the fear that had lodged itself in her throat made it impossible to speak. She was facing the architect of it all, the very person who had played them both like chess pieces. Why did you bring us here, Robert? Mark demanded. What was the point of all this? If you're part of this network, why lead us to the files? Why get us this far? Robert's gaze softened, just for a moment. Because you were my last hope, the last chance for someone to stop this madness. I thought you two could do it. You could bring them down. Sarah felt the anger surge through her. The last hope? He had led them into a labyrinth of lies and deceit, manipulating them into uncovering secrets that could have been their undoing. And now, he expected them to believe that he had a noble goal? She clenched her fists, but the exhaustion, the emotional toll of everything they had been through, made it hard to summon the strength to argue. She had been manipulated, just like Clint, just like Robert, just like everyone else who had ever been involved with the network. In the end, they were all victims of their own desire to uncover the truth. Robert, you've been a part of this from the beginning. Why now, at the end, do you want to stop it? Sarah said, her voice quieter but resolute. Robert paused. For a long moment, there was only silence between them. The cold wind stirred, rustling the trees, and Sarah thought she could hear the distant sound of sirens. They couldn't afford to waste time. They needed to make a decision. Finally, Robert spoke again, his voice softer this time. Because I can't keep living with this weight. I made a choice once, and now I'm paying for it. But you two still have a chance. You still have a choice." The gun was still raised, but his hand was trembling slightly now. It wasn't the calm, controlled posture of a man who had made peace with his actions. It was the hand of a man on the edge of something far darker. Mark's eyes flickered between Sarah and Robert. He seemed to be weighing the situation, trying to make sense of it all. "What do you want from us, Robert?" he asked, his voice steady but edged with anger. "What do you expect us to do now?" Robert didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a step closer, his eyes locked on Sarah's. "You have the files," he said softly. "You can expose everything. You can destroy the network. But be careful. They won't stop until they've wiped you out, too." His words were a warning, and Sarah knew they were true. The deeper they dug, the more dangerous it became. They had crossed a point of no return. "I don't know if I can believe you anymore," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "How do we know you're not just trying to protect yourself now?" "I'm not asking for your trust," Robert said, "but you have to decide. The clock is ticking, and if you wait too long, it'll be too late." There it was. The ultimatum. The choice Sarah and Mark had been avoiding for so long. To take the files and expose the network, or to destroy them and walk away from it all. But even if they walked away, could they really escape the people who had orchestrated this conspiracy? Could they outrun the enemies they had made? Mark turned to Sarah, his face hard. "We have to act. We can't let this go on any longer. We have to expose them." Sarah felt a wave of resolve wash over her. They had no choice. If they didn't do this now, they might never have another chance. The weight of the decision bore down on her, but there was a part of her that knew this was the only way forward. She nodded slowly. "You're right. We're going to expose them, no matter the cost." Robert's gaze softened, almost imperceptibly. "You're making the right choice. But remember, there's no going back after this." Without another word, he lowered the gun and took a step back, his shoulders slumping as though the burden he had carried for so long had finally become too much to bear. Sarah didn't hesitate. She turned toward Mark and began walking, the path forward clear now. The sirens in the distance grew louder, and they knew time was running out. They didn't have much longer to make their escape. Robert watched them go, his figure fading into the shadows of the mansion, as though he had never truly been a part of their world. He had played his part, and now he had become just another casualty of the game. As Sarah and Mark made their way through the dark, the weight of the files in Sarah's hands felt heavier than ever. But it wasn't the weight of the documents that burdened her now. It was the knowledge that this wasn't the end. The war had just begun. The world would know the truth. No matter the consequences, they had made their choice. The silence between Sarah and Mark was deafening as they rushed through the dense undergrowth, the heavy weight of the files between them more a burden than a triumph. Every step felt like it could be their last. The cold air nipped at their faces, and the sounds of the world outside seemed to blur into nothingness as they moved forward. The sirens were getting closer, a low wail that sent a chill down Sarah's spine. Time was running out. They had to get to the safe house and make sure the evidence reached the right hands. But how could they do that with everything closing in on them? How could they trust anyone now? Robert's betrayal had cast a shadow over everything they thought they knew. Mark glanced over at Sarah, his face hard, his eyes determined. "We can't go back. We have to finish this." Sarah nodded, though the doubt gnawed at her. They had always believed they were on the right side of this battle, but after Robert's revelation, she wasn't so sure anymore. They had been pawns, manipulated from the start. And yet, the path before them seemed clear. There was only one option now. They had to take down the network, no matter the cost. The safe house wasn't far, just a few miles from Clint's mansion, a small, inconspicuous cabin nestled in the woods, hidden from prying eyes. It was where they had planned to rendezvous with their contact, someone they had hoped they could trust. But after everything that had happened, Sarah wasn't so sure anymore. She could feel the tension building in her chest, the cold sweat on her palms, the sense of urgency that made her heart race. The city they had left behind felt a world away now, the places and people they once knew gone or corrupted. They were in the middle of nowhere, and there was no one to help them but each other. "Do you think Robert was lying?" Mark asked, his voice low. Sarah's mind raced. I don't know, she admitted. I want to believe he was trying to help us, but his actions don't line up with his words. He's been playing this game too long. I can't trust anything he says. Mark grimaced. I don't like this. We're walking into a trap. Sarah could feel the weight of his words pressing down on her. It was true. They were in uncharted waters now, and they couldn't afford to make any mistakes. Not after everything they had been through. Not after learning the truth about Clint. We don't have a choice, Sarah said finally. We have to keep going. If the files are exposed, everything changes. We can't stop now. Mark didn't say anything, but Sarah could see the doubt in his eyes. They were both carrying the same burden, the same fear, the same uncertainty. But they had come too far to turn back. The cabin loomed ahead, nestled in the trees like a secret they'd kept for far too long. The lights were off, the place eerily quiet, and Sarah's stomach tightened with dread. Had their contact already been compromised? Was it too late? As they reached the cabin, Sarah motioned for Mark to stay behind the trees while she approached cautiously. Her instincts screamed at her to turn back, but there was no time to second-guess. They needed to get the files to safety. They needed to make sure the truth would be revealed, no matter what. She stepped up to the door, pressing her ear to the cold wood. Silence. No sounds of movement from inside. She reached for the doorknob and twisted it slowly. It was unlocked. Sarah's breath hitched as she slowly pushed the door open, her eyes scanning the dimly lit room beyond. There were no signs of struggle, no signs of life, either. "Hello?" she called softly, stepping inside. Mark followed close behind, his body tense, his hand hovering near his gun. "What now?" he whispered. The silence was oppressive. There was no sign of their contact, no sign that anyone had been here recently. But the feeling of being watched was overwhelming, and Sarah could tell Mark felt it too. "Something's wrong," Mark muttered. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind them, and the sound of footsteps echoed from behind the walls, followed by a cold, familiar voice. "You shouldn't have come here, Sarah." Sarah's heart dropped into her stomach as she turned to face the voice. Standing in the doorway was none other than Robert, his face grim, his eyes cold. The betrayal was complete. "You were following us all along," Sarah said, her voice shaking. Robert didn't answer right away. He simply stepped forward, his gun trained on her and Mark. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," he said quietly. "You had your chance. You could have walked away." Mark took a step back, his voice steady. "You're the one who's making this hard. You brought us here, Robert. You brought us into this mess." Robert's lips curled into a bitter smile. "I didn't bring you here, Mark. You chose to come. You chose to dig too deep, and now it's too late. The network is already moving to cover its tracks. You've done enough damage already." Sarah clenched her fists, her mind racing. This was it. They were too late. The truth was slipping through their fingers. "We can't let you destroy everything," Sarah said, her voice hard. "The world deserves to know the truth. You can't hide it anymore." Robert's face darkened. "You don't understand. I've spent years protecting you from what's out there. I didn't want to do this, but you forced my hand." Mark stepped forward, his body tense. "You're lying. You've always been a part of it." Robert's eyes flickered with a hint of sadness, but the gun didn't waver. "I'm not lying. This is bigger than both of us. But you had to learn the hard way, just like everyone else. Now, if you want to live, you'll give me the files. You'll walk away." For a moment, Sarah thought about the choice before her. To fight, to run, to give up everything they had worked for. But then, something in her snapped. She couldn't let it go. Not now. Not after everything. "No," she said, her voice fierce. "We're going to expose this, Robert. We're going to finish what we started." A tense silence hung in the air, as Robert's eyes narrowed and Mark positioned himself between her and the gun. The clock was ticking. They had one last chance to make it out alive, and they weren't going down without a fight. Time seemed to freeze, the tension thick in the air as Sarah, Mark, and Robert stood in the dim light of the cabin. The thread of violence hung between them like a knife poised to fall. Robert's gun remained steady, pointed directly at them. Every breath they took felt like it could be their last. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, and she felt the heat of adrenaline flooding her veins. It wasn't just the fear of dying. It was the overwhelming sense of betrayal. Robert, the person they had trusted, the person who had led them into this nightmare, was now standing between them and the truth. The files in Sarah's hands, everything they had fought for, seemed to burn through her fingers, a heavy reminder that they were on the brink of losing it all. "You don't have to do this, Robert," Mark said, his voice calm, but with an undercurrent of desperation. "You don't have to make this harder." Robert's jaw clenched, and for a fleeting moment, Sarah saw something like regret flash across his face. But then it was gone, replaced by the hard, determined look he had worn throughout their entire journey. "It's too late for second chances," Robert replied, his voice colder now, almost mechanical. "You think you can just expose all of this and walk away? You'll never make it out alive. The network is too powerful." Mark didn't flinch. "We've come this far. We're not backing down now." Sarah's thoughts raced. They had one shot at this. The files were their only weapon against the network, and Robert knew that better than anyone. If they didn't find a way to use them now, they might never get another chance. But how? How could they outsmart him when he held all the power? A thought hit her like a bolt of lightning, and she locked eyes with Mark, silently communicating the plan. He gave her a quick nod, his face hard with resolve. They had one chance. "Robert," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the chaos in her chest, "you've made a mistake. You don't realize who you're up against." For a moment, Robert's eyes flickered with doubt, just a brief flash. But it was enough. He hesitated, just long enough for Sarah to make her move. She lunged. Mark was right behind her, his body shifting into position. The gunfire rang out, but Sarah was already diving to the side, her body colliding with Robert's in a desperate struggle. His grip on the gun tightened, but Sarah could feel the hesitation in his movements. He didn't want to hurt them. At least, not like this. "Drop it," Mark shouted as he moved in, grabbing Robert's arm and forcing the gun away. The two of them struggled, wrestling with Robert in the cramped space of the cabin. Sarah scrambled to her feet, heart racing, and in that instant, the entire situation felt like a nightmare, a chaotic blur of sounds and motion. She saw Robert's hand move toward his pocket, and instinctively, she lunged again, knocking him off balance. It all happened so quickly. The tension reached its peak when the gun went off, the bullet whizzing past Sarah's ear. For a moment, everything seemed to slow down, the air thick and heavy with the aftershock of the gunshot. Then, the deafening silence returned. Robert was on the ground, Mark standing over him, breathing heavily. Sarah's body was frozen in place, her hands still clutching the files. The shock of the moment hadn't quite worn off. They had just narrowly avoided disaster, and yet, she could still feel the weight of Robert's words echoing in her mind. "The network is too powerful." Mark looked down at Robert, his eyes narrowing. "We don't have time for this." Robert, still dazed, looked up at them. "You think you've won? You think the truth will save you? It's already too late. They'll come for you." Sarah swallowed, her throat tight with emotion. "We're not running anymore, Robert. We're finishing this." Robert didn't answer. He simply stared at her, his face a mask of defeat. For the first time, Sarah saw a flicker of fear in his eyes. He was no longer the puppet master, the one pulling the strings. He was just another pawn in a game that was spiraling out of control. "Help us, Robert," Sarah said, her voice softer now. "You don't have to be a part of this anymore. You can make things right." He didn't respond at first, his gaze distant. Then, with a deep, exhausted sigh, he nodded, almost imperceptibly. "You don't understand. There's no going back. But I'll try. I'll help you." It wasn't much, but it was something. A sign that Robert wasn't entirely lost, that there was still a shred of humanity left in him, buried under years of lies and manipulation. Mark took a step back, watching Robert carefully. "We need to get those files out now." Sarah nodded, her eyes still on Robert. "I'll take care of it. You go first. We need to move fast." Mark hesitated, but then turned, moving toward the door. "Be careful." The next few moments felt like a blur, Sarah and Mark both moving in sync, their hearts beating in unison as they began to put their plan into action. They had survived the worst of it, but the true battle was still ahead. The network wouldn't let them go without a fight. They were not out of danger yet. Sarah's hands trembled as she stuffed the files into a hidden compartment in her jacket, ensuring they were secure. She couldn't afford to lose them now, not after everything they had been through. This was it. There was no turning back. "Let's go," she said, her voice firm, but her heart pounding in her chest. Together, they stepped into the night. The world outside as dark and uncertain as the future they were about to face. But one thing was clear, the truth was out there, and they were going to make sure the world knew it. The night was darker than ever as Sarah, Mark, and Robert made their way through the woods, the weight of the situation pressing down on them like a storm cloud. The world felt like it was spinning faster than they could keep up with, the tension in the air so thick it was suffocating. But for the first time in what felt like forever, Sarah's mind wasn't racing with fear. It was focused, sharp, determined. They had come so far. They were so close. And yet, doubt lingered in the back of her mind. The closer they got to exposing the truth, the more it felt like the walls were closing in. What would happen once they released the files? Would anyone believe them? Or would it all be for nothing? The network was vast and powerful. There were people with untold resources, people who would stop at nothing to keep their secrets buried. But Sarah had made a promise to herself. She would not let them win. How much further? Robert's voice broke through Sarah's thoughts. They had been walking for what felt like hours, the path growing narrower and harder to follow as the woods around them thickened. Sarah glanced up at the sky, the stars barely visible through the trees. The safe house was just ahead, hidden deep within the forest, a place where they could finally send the evidence to the authorities. The place where they could finish this once and for all. "Not far," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside her. "Just a little longer." Mark walked a few steps ahead, his eyes constantly scanning the area, ever watchful, ever vigilant. They couldn't afford to be caught off guard now, not when they were so close to achieving everything they had worked for. Suddenly, a noise, a rustle of leaves behind them. Sarah's body went stiff as she turned her head sharply. Mark spun around, hand instinctively reaching for his gun, eyes darting through the dark. Nothing. The silence returned. "False alarm," Mark muttered, but Sarah could see the tension in his body. He wasn't buying it. Neither was she. They continued onward, but the unease gnawed at her, like something was wrong, like they were being watched. She kept her pace steady, unwilling to let fear take over now. They had made it this far. They couldn't falter now. When they finally reached the cabin, it was just as Sarah remembered. Quiet, hidden, secure. The perfect place to send the evidence off to the authorities and watch the world change. But as they reached the door, Sarah felt a strange weight in her chest. Something was off. "Stay alert," Mark whispered, his voice low but urgent. Robert was already at the door, his hand on the knob. He turned back to them with a hesitant expression, as if unsure whether to move forward or turn back. "I'm not sure this is a good idea. If they're onto us—" "Robert," Sarah cut him off. "We're not turning back. Not now." He looked at her for a long moment before nodding, opening the door slowly. Inside, the cabin was dimly lit, the air stale and cold. There was no sign of their contact, the person who was supposed to help them get the files out of their hands and into the right ones. Sarah's heart sank. What if they had been set up? What if this was all a trap? "Something's not right," Mark muttered, his voice low. "I know," Sarah said, her mind racing. "We have to move fast. We'll send the files anyway. It's better than leaving them here." She moved to the table in the center of the room, where she quickly set the files down. As she opened the folder to insert the final report, she noticed something, a small, folded note wedged between the pages. Her heart skipped a beat. It was addressed to her. "You're too late. The files are already in motion. You can't stop this." Her blood ran cold. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. Robert had been right. The network was already moving. They had been a step ahead the entire time. She looked up at Mark, who had read the note over her shoulder. "What does this mean?" he asked, his voice tight. "It means we've been played," Sarah replied, her voice barely above a whisper. The files, they were never going to be enough. Mark clenched his fists, his face hardening. They knew we would come here. They were one step ahead of us the whole time. A deep sense of anger burned inside Sarah, but it was mixed with an even greater sense of betrayal. She had trusted Robert. They had all trusted him. And now, they were on the verge of losing everything. What now? Robert's voice was quieter now, his eyes shifting nervously. Sarah turned to him, her eyes narrowing. What happened to the person who was supposed to help us? Where are they? Robert swallowed hard, looking away. I don't know. I thought they would be here. The door slammed shut behind them, and before anyone could react, a voice rang out from the shadows. You thought you could stop this? Sarah's blood ran cold as a figure emerged from the darkness. It was familiar, a figure she had seen before. Her mind raced, and the realization hit her like a slap in the face. It was Clint Eastwood. Clint Eastwood, the man who had once been a trusted ally, a figure they believed was on their side, was standing before them now as their greatest enemy. He smiled coldly, stepping forward. Did you really think you could expose me? You're too late, Sarah. The game was over the moment you stepped foot in my world. Clint, you, Mark started, but Sarah held up a hand, cutting him off. How long, Clint? She asked, her voice shaking with a mix of disbelief and fury. How long have you been controlling this whole thing? How long have you been watching us? Clint's smile widened. You were never meant to win, Sarah. You were never meant to see the truth. You should have stayed away, but you just couldn't help yourselves, could you? You had to dig deeper, had to expose things you didn't understand. Mark stepped forward, his fists clenched. We'll stop you. We'll make sure the truth gets out. Clint laughed, a cold, hollow sound. You think you can stop this? You're already too late. The network is bigger than you. It's bigger than anything you could imagine. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest, her thoughts a whirl of confusion and anger. She thought they had one. She thought they had the truth in their hands. But Clint's words echoed in her mind. It's too late. But there was one thing Clint didn't count on. Sarah's refusal to give up. No matter how many twists this story took, no matter how many times she was knocked down, Sarah refused to lose. She wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. The tension in the room was palpable, thick with the weight of betrayal. Clint Eastwood, the man who had once seemed like an ally, now stood before them as their enemy. His very presence sent a chill through the cabin, the shadows of the past closing in. Sarah's heart raced, and yet, in that moment, a spark of clarity flickered in her mind. They had been played, yes, but it wasn't over. Not yet. Clint's smug grin widened, and for a moment, Sarah could almost feel the weight of his smug confidence. He had all the power now, or so he thought. But Sarah knew one thing for sure. He wasn't untouchable. The network might have seemed invincible, but it was far from it. There was always a way to bring down the giants, and that was what they had been fighting for all along. You're making a big mistake, Clint, Sarah said, her voice calm but filled with fire. You think you've won, but the truth will always come out. It's bigger than you. Clint chuckled darkly, his eyes narrowing as he stepped closer. You don't get it, do you, Sarah? The truth is already out there. It's in motion, and it's too late for you to stop it. The network is far too powerful. Mark, standing beside Sarah, clenched his fists, his jaw tight. We haven't come this far just to let you win, Clint. Whatever game you think you're playing, we're still in it. Clint's smile faltered, just for a second, but it was enough for Sarah to see it. A crack in the facade. He wasn't as confident as he appeared, and that was their opening. You're not walking away from this, Sarah continued, her voice more determined now. The files might have been compromised, but there's more. There's always more. And we're going to expose it all. Clint took a step back, his eyes flicking toward the door as if he were calculating his escape route. Sarah caught the movement, a surge of adrenaline coursing through her veins. He's scared. He's not invincible. I don't think you understand, Sarah, Clint said slowly, his voice low. You've crossed a line, and now you'll pay the price. With that, he turned sharply, heading for the door. It was the opening they needed, the perfect opportunity to make their move. Mark, go. Sarah shouted, taking a step toward Clint. Mark didn't hesitate. In an instant, he was at the door, blocking Clint's path. Not so fast. Clint's eyes flared with anger. He reached for the gun holstered at his side, but Sarah was quicker. In one fluid motion, she lunged forward, grabbing his wrist and forcing it down. "Stay down, Clint," Sarah commanded, her voice shaking but strong. "You've lost." But Clint wasn't done yet. With a brutal twist, he wrenched his arm free, slamming Sarah into the wall. Pain shot through her body, but she refused to let go. She wasn't going to give up. Not now. Mark reached for Clint's arm, pulling him away from Sarah, and in that moment, a shot rang out, piercing the silence of the cabin. Time seemed to slow. For a second, everything was chaos. Sarah's heart stopped as the echo of the gunshot rang in her ears. The world tilted, and her eyes darted between Clint, Mark, and the blood pooling on the floor. She couldn't breathe. No, 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 no. Mark collapsed to his knees, his hand pressed against his chest where blood began to seep through his shirt. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. This couldn't be happening. Not now. Not after everything. "Mark!" Sarah screamed, rushing to his side. Her hands shook as she tried to stop the bleeding, but the wound was deep. Too deep. Clint stood a few feet away, his face a mask of calm as he holstered his weapon. "You should have stayed out of this," he said coldly. "Now look what you've done." Sarah's mind spun as she looked down at Mark, her heart in her throat. He was slipping away, his breathing shallow. The world around her seemed to fade, and the only thing that mattered was him. She couldn't lose him now. She couldn't. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Please don't leave me." Mark's hand reached up, weakly brushing against her cheek. His lips moved, but the words barely escaped. I'm sorry." Tears burned in Sarah's eyes as she shook her head, refusing to accept it. "No, no, Mark. You can't go. Not like this." But his hand fell limp, his body going still. For a moment, Sarah didn't move. The world felt like it had collapsed around her. Mark, the one person who had stood by her through everything, was gone. And it was Clint's fault. Her grief gave way to rage, a fury unlike anything she had ever felt. She stood up slowly, her body trembling with a mix of pain and fury, and turned her burning gaze on Clint. "You are dead," she hissed, her voice filled with venom. Clint didn't flinch. He simply watched her with cold, calculating eyes. "You think you can stop me? You can't. You've lost." But something had shifted inside Sarah. Mark was gone, but she wasn't finished. Clint might have taken the one person she cared about, but she was going to make him pay. She would make sure the world knew the truth. She would make sure they exposed the network once and for all. With every ounce of strength she had left, Sarah moved toward Clint, her mind laser-focused. This was it. This was her moment. She wasn't going to back down. "You took everything from me," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "But you won't take my fight." Clint's face hardened as he reached for his gun again, but Sarah was faster. She lunged forward, knocking the weapon from his hand and tackling him to the ground. The struggle was brief but brutal, and before Clint could react, Sarah had pinned him down. "You don't get to win," she said through gritted teeth. "Not today." With a swift motion, she grabbed Clint's phone, unlocked it, and began sending the files to the authorities. They were done hiding. They were done running. The truth was out. She looked down at Clint, a fire in her eyes. "You've lost, Clint." And this time, there was no way out. The minutes that followed were a blur of chaos and tension. As Sarah hovered over Clint Eastwood, pinning him down and watching as the final pieces of evidence were sent to the authorities, she felt a sickening sense of relief. It was over, or at least it should have been. But nothing in this world ever came easy, and the path to victory was rarely a straight line. She had never imagined her life would come to this, a struggle for justice that involved betrayal, secrets, and sacrifices. As Clint's breath became shallow beneath her, his smirk faded into frustration, and Sarah's heart pounded faster. She couldn't allow herself to feel the victory just yet, not until she knew the files were in the right hands. But then it happened. A sudden vibration from Clint's pocket made Sarah's pulse spike. She glanced down at him, who was still glaring up at her, and then quickly retrieved the phone from his side. The screen was glowing with a new message, a notification from an encrypted network. Her stomach twisted as she unlocked the phone, her eyes scanning the message that could change everything. The message was chilling. You've made a grave mistake. The truth you're chasing isn't what it seems. You're too late. The blood drained from Sarah's face. What did this mean? She quickly scrolled through Clint's messages, heart hammering in her chest, looking for anything that would explain this warning. There was a string of cryptic notes, all leading to a chilling realization. The files she had just sent? They weren't the full picture. They were only a fraction of the puzzle. The real truth? It was still hidden, buried beneath layers of deception that even she hadn't anticipated. The weight of it all crashed down on her. It wasn't over. It was never over. Clint's cold, taunting laugh broke through her thoughts. You really thought you could bring me down, didn't you? You have no idea what you're messing with. The people you're working with, they're not who you think they are. Sarah's hands shook as she held the phone, her mind racing. What are you talking about? Clint leaned forward slightly, his voice cold and calculated. The files you just sent, they're just a distraction. A decoy. I knew you'd find them, but it's all part of the plan. The real power is hidden deeper, in places you'll never reach. You've played right into our hands. Stop it, Sarah whispered, her heart sinking. She refused to believe it. She couldn't. I'm just getting started, Clint continued, his smile now one of true malice. You thought you were winning? Think again. This is only the beginning, Sarah. The real game is about to begin, and you're not prepared for it. For a moment, everything in Sarah's world came crashing down. The fight, the evidence, the sacrifices. Had it all been for nothing? Had they truly been led on a wild goose chase? She thought she had exposed the network. She thought she had uncovered the truth. But now it felt like everything was slipping through her fingers. But then, a voice echoed in her mind. A voice that she knew all too well. You can't give up. Not now. You're too close. Mark's face flashed before her eyes. The memory of his smile, his unshakable belief in her, came rushing back. It was in that moment that she realized something crucial. The fight wasn't just about the files. It wasn't just about Clint Eastwood or the network. It was about something bigger. It was about justice. It was about truth. And it was about never backing down, no matter how dark things got. Clint's smirk only grew as he watched Sarah's internal struggle play out on her face. You're too emotional. Too weak. You won't survive this. You'll never bring me down. But Sarah didn't flinch. She couldn't afford to. She thought of Mark, of all the people who had believed in her, of the families who had been affected by the network's secrecy. The truth mattered, and it would come to light, no matter how many obstacles were in her way. She stood up, breathing heavily as she looked down at Clint. His arrogance was no longer amusing to her. It was infuriating. He had underestimated her, and she wouldn't make the same mistake. She had a mission, and nothing would stand in her way. Clint, she said, her voice steady, you think you're untouchable. You think you've won, but you're wrong. This isn't over. I'm not done yet. Clint laughed again, his laugh hollow and devoid of any real joy. You don't understand, do you? You're too far gone. You'll never stop this. Sarah took a deep breath, steadying herself. I'm not trying to stop it, Clint. I'm trying to expose it. And that's something you'll never be able to hide. Before Clint could respond, Sarah swiftly grabbed his phone and slammed it on the ground, shattering it into pieces. She wasn't playing his game anymore. The truth was bigger than his threats. Her heart was pounding in her chest as she turned away from him. She wasn't sure what the future held. She wasn't even sure who the real enemy was anymore. But she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't stop fighting. As she walked out of the cabin, her mind began to race again. Clint was right about one thing. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. And now, the fight would be for something even bigger than herself. The files, the evidence, the deception, all of it had only scratched the surface of the power that Clint and the network held. But Sarah wasn't backing down. She couldn't. The truth had to come out, no matter the cost. The next step was crucial. and the battle ahead would be unlike anything she had ever faced. But Sarah was ready. She had to be. The days that followed felt like a blur, each one dragging by slower than the last. Sarah's mind was clouded with questions that she couldn't answer, about Clint, the network, and the new players who had just entered the game. She hadn't expected to come so close to the truth, only to realize how far from it she really was. But there was no time to dwell on failure. The stakes were too high. Her phone buzzed on the table, dragging her from her thoughts. The name that flashed across the screen made her freeze. Detective Harris. She had expected a call like this, but the nerves in her stomach twisted anyway. Sarah had spent countless hours gathering evidence, working with the authorities to expose Clint's dark secrets. Now, they were closer than ever to bringing the entire network to its knees. But there was still so much she didn't know, still so much at risk. With a deep breath, Sarah answered the phone. Detective Harris? Sarah, it's time, came the voice on the other end. We've got the pieces we need. We've confirmed Clint's involvement in the network, but there's a bigger player pulling the strings. It's someone we didn't expect. Her heart skipped a beat. Who? The detective paused for a moment, a hint of uncertainty creeping into his voice. It's someone in your circle, Sarah. Someone who's been involved much longer than you realize. Someone who may have had a hand in everything that's happened to you. The shock hit her like a freight train. Her stomach dropped, and her mind raced to process the information. What do you mean? Who are you talking about? Mark, the detective said, his words heavy with unspoken implications. We found evidence that he was more involved in the network than anyone realized. We think he was working with Clint from the beginning. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. That's impossible. Mark would never. He was my partner in this. He helped me. I know, Detective Harris interrupted, his voice sympathetic but firm. But the evidence is there, Sarah. And right now, we don't know who we can trust. We need to figure this out, and we need to do it fast. The words hung in the air, suffocating her. Mark? The thought of him betraying her was unbearable. She had spent countless hours fighting for justice, pushing forward in his memory after his death, and now the possibility that he had been working against her all along felt like a betrayal too great to comprehend. Detective, I need more time. I can't believe it. Mark was my friend. He wouldn't have. Sarah, we don't have time for this, Harris said, his voice more urgent now. We need you to stay focused. You've been getting closer to the truth. You need to find out exactly what Mark was involved in before it's too late. The call ended abruptly, leaving Sarah standing there in stunned silence. The room seemed to close in around her as her mind reeled from the revelation. Could Mark have been part of the network? Could he have been playing both sides, all while pretending to be her ally? It didn't make sense. Everything about Mark felt genuine. His belief in their cause, his friendship, his sacrifice. But the evidence was in front of her. She had no choice but to face the possibility. As she sat down at the table, her hands shaking, Sarah's thoughts turned back to Clint. If he was right about one thing, it was that the fight wasn't over. She had uncovered only part of the story. Now, it was time to uncover the rest. But how could she trust anyone after this? How could she move forward knowing that someone close to her had been working against her all along? Her phone buzzed again, and she picked it up without thinking. This time, the message was from an unknown number. Meet me at the usual spot. I have answers. R. The letter R. Sarah's pulse quickened. She knew exactly who it was. The mysterious figure who had helped her navigate the dark web of secrets from the beginning. But who could she really trust now? The question burned in her mind, unanswered. But she had no choice. She had to meet R. She had to know the truth. The alley was dark, illuminated only by the dim streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement. The usual spot was a small, nondescript coffee shop tucked away in a corner, far from prying eyes. Sarah had been here before, meeting her under the cover of night, when everything seemed uncertain and fragile. This time felt different, though. The stakes had never been higher. The lies were deep, and the consequences of trusting the wrong person were terrifying. As she entered the coffee shop, her eyes immediately found her sitting in a corner booth, their face obscured by a hood and sunglasses. The figure was a master of staying hidden, always operating in the shadows. Sarah said, her voice low. I need answers. Didn't look up, but their voice was calm, almost detached. You're starting to understand, aren't you? Understand what? Sarah snapped, frustration bubbling over. That Mark might have been a traitor? That I've been played this whole time? Tell me the truth, I deserve that much. Finally looked up, their eyes betraying a hint of sadness. The truth is complicated, Sarah, but I'm here to help you understand it. There's more to Mark's involvement than you realize. He wasn't just working for Clint. He was trying to take the network down from the inside. He sacrificed himself to give you the edge you needed. Sarah blinked, trying to process the information. But how do I know this is true? How do I know I can trust you? You don't, said quietly. But sometimes, you have to choose what you believe in. And I'm offering you the truth. Mark knew that the network was too powerful. But he also knew it would never be stopped unless someone took the ultimate risk. That's why he worked with Clint. To get close. To get the leverage he needed. A lump formed in Sarah's throat. Mark had sacrificed himself? Then why didn't you tell me? She asked, the hurt in her voice barely contained. Why keep me in the dark? Leaned forward slightly. Because it wasn't time yet. You weren't ready to know. But now you are. You're the one who will bring this down, Sarah. You just have to finish what Mark started. Sarah's heart ached as she absorbed the weight of R's words. Mark hadn't betrayed her. He had been playing a dangerous game, one that required him to hide his true intentions. The path forward was clear. It wasn't over. The battle wasn't won. But now Sarah understood the truth, and with it, the courage to continue. She stood up, her resolve stronger than ever. I'm ready. Gave her a small nod. Good. Then let's finish this. Sarah couldn't remember the last time she'd felt so conflicted. The weight of everything she had learned over the past few days settled heavily in her chest, but it was a different kind of weight now. The truth, Mark's sacrifice, his hidden intentions, the game he had played from the inside, had shifted her understanding of the entire mission. She stood at the edge of a precipice. There was no going back, and the stakes were higher than they'd ever been. Sarah had come so far, fought so hard to expose the truth, but now, the real challenge was about to begin. What had once felt like an urgent mission for justice had evolved into a battle for something even greater, the chance to dismantle a powerful, dangerous network of corruption. The files Clint had left behind, the cryptic messages, the shadowy figures pulling the strings, it was all coming into focus now. But the pieces weren't enough. They never were. They were fragments of a story, and Sarah needed to put them together. And then there was R. They had given her the answers she needed, but the truth was a hard pill to swallow. It was clear that R had been one step ahead of everyone, orchestrating a delicate dance of information and misdirection. But who could they be, really? And how much of their involvement could she trust? They had told her the network was still operating in full force, ready to counter any threats, but Sarah had no intention of letting them win. She had no choice but to trust them now. She looked at the clock on the wall. Late. Far later than she'd intended. The final confrontation was drawing near, and she needed to act before Clint and his allies could regroup. They would be planning their next move already. He was never someone to stay down for long, but Sarah knew exactly where she needed to go. The hidden tunnel under Clint's villa, the one she had unearthed just days ago, was the key. It wasn't just a physical tunnel. It was the nerve center, the very foundation of the network's operations. Whatever Clint had hidden down there, it was the heart of the empire she needed to destroy. The real power, the real threat, lay beneath the villa, and Sarah was determined to bring it to light. As she gathered her gear, the familiar sense of urgency returned. She was ready to face whatever came next, knowing that she would need to outsmart those who had been playing the game far longer than she had. The rules had changed, and Sarah would need every ounce of courage and determination to survive. When she arrived at Clint's villa, she could already feel the tension in the air. The sprawling estate loomed over her, like a fortress designed to keep prying eyes away from its dark secrets. Sarah's heart pounded as she made her way toward the secret entrance. The tunnel had been hidden under the foundation of the villa, and Clint had clearly gone to great lengths to ensure no one would ever stumble upon it. But Sarah had been relentless in her pursuit of the truth, And now, she had a key to the puzzle. The tunnel was her only path to the final answers. It was a descent into the unknown, but it was the only way forward. The moment she stepped into the tunnel, the cool air hit her like a wave. Her flashlight flickered as she moved deeper into the earth, her footsteps echoing off the stone walls. Each step brought her closer to the heart of Clint's empire. The deeper she went, the more the air seemed to hum with the weight of hidden secrets. She could feel it. Everything had led to this. The betrayal, the lies, the sacrifices. It was all converging in this one moment. Her pulse quickened as she approached the heart of the tunnel. A set of heavy steel doors stood in front of her, locked and seemingly impervious to anyone who might try to breach them. But Sarah had anticipated this. She had prepared for this. The lock on the door was high-tech, sophisticated, but not impossible to crack. With trembling hands, she set to work. The seconds felt like hours as she worked through the code, trying to force the lock to give. She knew that the clock was ticking. Clint's network wouldn't stay dormant for long. She had to get through. Finally, the lock clicked. The door swung open. Inside, Sarah was met with a sight that made her blood run cold. The room was filled with monitors and servers, all buzzing with activity. It was a control center, a hub of operations that had been orchestrating the network's activities. But there was something else, something more disturbing. Behind the rows of technology, a massive wall of files stretched from the floor to the ceiling. Redacted documents, secret agreements, and confidential communications. Everything Clint had hidden to maintain control over his empire. And there, sitting in the center of it all, was a man. A man she didn't recognize at first, but one whose face was all too familiar now. Detective Harris. Surprised? He asked, his voice calm and cold. Sarah froze, her heart hammering in her chest. You were part of this all along. Harris stood from his seat, his expression unreadable. You have no idea what you've been up against, Sarah. This network is more powerful than you can imagine. And you've been chasing ghosts. No, she said, her voice steady despite the shock that surged through her. I've been chasing the truth, and I'm not done yet. Harris stepped closer, a hint of amusement in his eyes. You think you're going to destroy everything we've built? You don't understand the game you've been playing. You're wrong, Sarah retorted, her eyes narrowing. I understand it better than you think, and I'm going to bring it all down. Before she could react, the lights in the room flickered, and an alarm blared. The network was going into lockdown, responding to her intrusion. Harris's smile faded, replaced by a look of frustration. You've activated the failsafe, he muttered, glancing at the monitors. You've just sealed your fate, Sarah. But Sarah wasn't intimidated. She had come too far, sacrificed too much, to turn back now. She had the evidence, she had the truth, and she would stop at nothing to expose it all. With determination in her eyes, Sarah launched herself at the control panel, overriding the lockdown protocols. The countdown to the final confrontation had begun. She was ready, and this time, nothing was going to stop her. The months that followed the fall of Clint Eastwood's empire were a blur of activity for Sarah. There was the endless paperwork, the press conferences, and the overwhelming surge of attention from law enforcement, the media, and even the public. Everyone wanted a piece of the story, wanted to know what it had taken to bring down one of the most dangerous and secretive networks in the world. But for Sarah, the whirlwind of attention didn't matter. What mattered was what had come after the dust settled. The aftermath of everything she had uncovered, and the quiet moments when she could reflect on the journey that had brought her to this point. The first few weeks after the takedown had been a mixture of triumph and grief. Clint's network had been rooted out, but the damage they'd caused was far-reaching. The lives they had ruined, through lies, manipulation, and sheer power, couldn't be repaired overnight. Sarah had done everything she could to expose the truth, but there would always be scars. She thought back to her first days in the villa, standing there with nothing but a hunch and an overwhelming sense of injustice driving her forward. It had all seemed so daunting then, like an impossible puzzle that she would never be able to solve. Now, standing in front of her apartment's window, looking out over the city, Sarah knew she had become a different person. Stronger, wiser, more attuned to the realities of the world around her. Mark's memory still lingered, a quiet presence in her heart. She had never fully understood the sacrifice he had made, the lengths he had gone to protect her and the mission. But now, she carried his spirit with her, as a reminder that no matter how dark the world might seem, there was always light to be found, if you were willing to fight for it. She received a call late one afternoon from Detective Lawson, the officer who had been instrumental in taking down Clint's operation. "Sarah," he said, his voice filled with something she couldn't quite place. "I wanted to let you know that things are moving in the right direction. We're still seeing the fallout from Clint's empire, but there's hope. And a lot of people are starting to realize the power of what you did." Sarah smiled softly, feeling a sense of relief wash over her. It wasn't just about her anymore. It wasn't just about winning one fight. It was about creating a ripple effect, a wave that would change the way things were done. Later that evening, she sat in a small cafe, her notebook open in front of her, the soft hum of conversation in the background. Her phone buzzed with a message from R, the mysterious ally who had guided her through the darkest moments of the mission. "Mission complete. The network is dismantled. But this is just the beginning. There's always more to uncover. Stay ready." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She had thought the end of the network meant the end of the road, but R was right. There was always more. The world was full of hidden secrets, power structures that thrived in the shadows, and people willing to do anything to stay at the top. But Sarah wasn't afraid anymore. She had found her purpose, and that purpose was bigger than just exposing Clint Eastwood's operation. It was about continuing the fight for justice, uncovering the truth, and making sure the world knew that there were still those who would stand up against the darkness. Her phone rang again. It was Daniel, a close friend who had been with her throughout the entire journey. "Sarah," he said, his voice filled with excitement, "I've got good news. You've got an offer. Someone wants to meet you about a new project, something big. They think you're the one to help lead it." Sarah paused, her fingers tracing the edge of her notebook. It felt like the world was opening up in front of her again, offering a new path, a new chapter. "I don't know," she said slowly. "I wasn't planning on diving back into anything like that just yet. I need some time to think." Daniel's voice softened. "I get it. Take the time you need. But don't let this opportunity pass you by. It's not just about the money. This could be a chance to do something that really makes a difference." As she sat there, considering the offer, Sarah realized something that surprised her. She didn't feel the need to rush. For the first time in a long while, she was content to let the future unfold on its own terms. She had been through so much, faced so many challenges, and come out on the other side stronger than she had ever thought possible. But the truth was, Sarah had always known this day would come. She had never been someone to rest on her laurels or live in the comfort of past victories. The world was full of injustices waiting to be uncovered, and as long as she was breathing, she would fight for what was right. In the coming weeks, she took time for herself, time to heal, time to reflect, and time to reconnect with the people who mattered most. There was still so much work to be done, but Sarah knew that she would face it with a clearer head and a stronger heart. And then, one evening, she received a message that felt like a new beginning. R had reached out again, this time with a direct invitation to meet. "It's time to start the next chapter," the message read. "You in?" Without hesitation, Sarah typed her response, "I'm in." As she hit send, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. The world was always changing, always presenting new challenges. But Sarah had found something that could never be taken from her. A sense of purpose, a determination to make the world a better place, and the strength to face whatever came next. The journey wasn't over. It had only just begun. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?